I'm a plain man with plain tools, and if folks call me surly, it is only because I have spent most of my life listening to winds that do not care for pleasantries. If you will walk the wet flags with me, I can show you what Misselthwaite shows only to those who keep their eyes low and ears open. Do not expect grand speeches. Expect boots that take the long way round puddles, stone that keeps its chill at noon, and a sky so wide it straightens your back. The moor presses our walls like a rough blanket, and in March the peat smell rides every breath. That was the air the morning Mary Lennox arrived, thin as wire and pale as early frost. Come close and mind your step. We will begin where all good garden stories begin, at the edge of sleep and waking, where dead-looking stems hold a little life, and an old gate waits for a hand that does not yet know it belongs to her. I was cutting back dead wood along the south beds when the carriage groaned up the drive. The house looked as it always does after a hard winter, long-faced and grey. Mary stepped out with her chin set and eyes measuring everything as if it might bite. A robin, my old comrade, stood to attention on a trowel handle and gave her a brisk once-over. He hopped nearer, chest bright as a seal, and she, prickly as nettle, held her ground. 10 years earlier there had been laughter in a certain garden, then grief, and then a key turned in a lock, and the ivy allowed to thicken until even memory had to push to find light. Folks in a great house learn to walk another way when they come to a closed door. The master went abroad. The servants kept their tongues still. As for me, I kept the wall mended and my eyes averted. Mary did not know our customs, Yorkshire or otherwise. She arrived with the pinched temper of a child indulged by neglect, sharp in small ways and timid in large ones. If she had been a shrub, I would have cut her back and staked her against the wind. Yet there was a stubborn green under the frost of her manner. She asked after paths, after animals, after why the wind sounded like crying in certain chimneys. The staff told her to mind her business, as big houses teach the young. Children rarely do. That afternoon she met me by the shed and inquired, with an authority that surprised both of us, whether I was the gardener. I told her I was, and more than I meant to, that the moor heals a person who lets it, that soil has moods, that robins are little old men in feathered coats and best treated with respect. She scowled and nodded, which in some children is how they say thank you. I am not good at kindness, but plants teach what they must. I set a fork in her hands and showed her how to turn a clod without bruising the worms, how to soften the edge of the prongs against the earth so the soil falls back in a quiet crumble and does not scatter. Later, I watched her shadow move along the wall where the ivy knits into a curtain. The robin darted there, swift as a thought you are not sure you ought to have. He had been fussing at that spot for days. I had pretended not to notice. Gardens are like people. They do not always answer when called, but they do hear. Under the tangle, roots kept their counsel. Buds sat like tight fists. The garden behind that wall had been sleeping, not dead. I knew as much because I have put my ear to more than one bed of earth, and heard the slow breath that begins before a leaf dares show itself. Nights at Misselthwaite have their own sounds. Doors sigh. The moor hums. Sometimes there is a weeping that seems to come from a corner where no one stands. The child heard it as honest ears do, and began to collect questions the way a thrifty person collects string. She gathered also small pleasures, buttered bread after a walk, a patch of sun on the step, the satisfaction of scraping mould from a pot and making it clean. You may ask why a rough old gardener bothered with an odd, fretful girl. The answer is not tidy. Loss lives in houses as surely as draughts do, and I had braced myself against both. But work makes a bridge where talk cannot. We shared a robin, we shared a wind. We shared without speaking the knowledge that a certain door existed. She did not yet know the key story, nor that keys, like children, sometimes turn up where no one thinks to look. If a tale must have an emblem, let it be this: a small hand held out to a bird considering, and between them a square of winter light that does not promise spring, yet makes it imaginable. As the day thinned, chimneys shouldered smoke, and the moor's brown turned violet. I locked the shed and walked away with my grumble intact, and my hope, uninvited, following like a stray. But we still wonder whether a closed door keeps sorrow safe, or keeps joy from escaping before we are ready. A man of my trade learns to wait for frost to lift before he puts a spade in. Waiting is not laziness, it is respect for the laws of living things. In our lives too, stirring too soon can ruin what might bloom if left 2 days more. If you have ever lifted the lid of a pot before a pudding set, you know the lesson. The moor does a body good. A brisk walk will right a sulk quicker than a scolding. Bread and dripping after a cold hour taste like feast enough for a king. You do not need grand philosophy to begin mending. You need a draught, a task, and something small to care for. So our story begins not with a trumpet, but with a hinge, remembering how to move. A lonely child arrived from far-off heat to our stone and wind. A secret slept behind leaves. A robin made introductions, and an old man who had kept sullen watch over both grief and soil felt the first quiet move of change as surely as a bud feels the longer light. Walk on with me. The wind off the moor has a way of telling you the truth, without ceremony. It comes over the heather with a smell of iron and peat, tastes of rain, whether the sky has any or not, and gives a person a brisk accounting of bones and resolve. Mary took to it unwillingly at first, as anyone will who has been kept indoors by habit rather than weather. Yet I saw the wind lay a hand upon her shoulders and square them by degrees, the way a kindly aunt sets a child straight before sending her across a room. Martha Sowerby, red-cheeked and tender with the rough kindness that makes bread of plain flour, had more to do with this than I. She brought in tales of the moor, of her brother Dickon, who seemed to know every fur and feather upon it, and of lambs that needed coaxing and foxes that did not. Her talk was full of the dialect as the moor is full of larks, and I watched Mary, puzzled and haughty, learn to hear what came through the unfamiliar sounds. When Martha put a skipping rope in her hands and suggested the walks that would bring back appetite and colour, the child scowled as if insulted by the suggestion that she needed either. The next afternoon I saw her counting steps along the path, rope hitting the flags with satisfactory cracks, and the scowl had become concentration. It is a small miracle, but no smaller for being common, to see a child discover she can manufacture warmth without a fire, I kept to my rounds and pretended disinterest. The south beds needed clearing, the gravel paths wanted raking. A piece of wall by the kitchen garden had settled and would need new pointing before the ivy took too firm a hold. I have found that when grown-ups look too hard at the beginnings of children, those beginnings shy and slip back underground, like hedgehogs. So I gave Mary my back and let the robin do the introductions the rest of the way. He is a better diplomat than I shall ever be. As she walked more, the house grew fewer corners for her vexation to hide in. She noticed the sharp light in the late morning, when clouds break and blue pours through like water into a bucket. She learned where the path dips and collects puddles, and how to take them at a hop rather than a sulky trudge. She asked me the names of things, and I told them in the order they prefer. Gorse, with its stubborn prickles and surprising gold. Broom, which sings to wind. Columbine, shy and precise. Hawthorn, white with May, like a song too bright for the ear if you stand too near. Names are keys too, though they open a different sort of door. Sometimes the wind carries voices that belong to the past. On such days I found Mary standing by the east wall, her face turned as if to catch words the rest of us had grown too used to hearing. The house does not forget easily. There are rooms that keep their old air, corridors that keep footsteps. At night the weeping returned, thin as a reed pipe 3 floors away. The staff said a gust in a flue is a flue, no more and no less. Mary did not argue, but she kept a tally of those sounds in her mind. I know, because I have kept such tallies myself, and only those who do can spot the habit in others. When she came to me one morning to ask why the robin had taken such a fancy to a particular length of wall, I only grunted. I had seen him fussing there for days, cocking his head and delivering advice no one seemed to follow. The ivy in that place was thicker, and the mortar older. To the left, a stone had a different temper under the chisel last autumn. I have a nose for walls, as some men have for weather. There are secrets in stone, some of them best left sleeping, but Mary had the look of one already dreaming the dream. The secret wanted her to dream. I am not a man to speak poetry aloud, and yet there it was. She began to carry a small trowel in her pocket as if it were a lucky coin. In truth, it is the luck that follows the tool, not the other way round. She cleared a patch by the steps and planted a few stubborn bulbs she found in an old basket, bulbs that had dried to husks, but still held their map for spring. Every gardener knows the embarrassment of a plant succeeding despite inattention. I did not tell her the odds. Better to let a child learn the arithmetic from the green itself. If they come up, she would learn happiness. If they did not, she would learn courage. On the second week, she happened upon the ancient bit of ground near the orchard where the grass grows thin, and within it a scorched circle I myself had never marked. I could see her thinking that circles, whether made of stones or of ash, mean something has been and could be done again. She asked about bonfires, and I told her Guy Fawkes's night comes with November, and this was March. And in March the fires belong under the soil, not above. Seeds burn in their own way. A dull gardener tries to force July into March. A wise one lets March be March. The child nodded, as if told a law she could test. Martha's mother sent a basket now and then, and inside the brown paper there would be simple things like oatcakes and cheese and a jar of something sharp that bit the tongue and made the eyes bright. We shared them, Mary with careful politeness, I with a pretence of reluctance. A body works better for modest fuel taken outdoors. If you have ever carried your breakfast to a step and eaten it with your coat on, you know how it turns into a celebration without anyone wasting money or words. In the afternoons, the robin arranged performances. He would alight on the end of a fork or balance on a knot in the wall, and give a run of phrases that sounded like chatter but did the business of directions. He drew Mary's eye to a strip of earth along the wall's base where the ivy thinned. She crouched there, small and intent, and picked at moss with the trowel's tip. A child can worry a secret out of its hiding the way a tide worries a stone out of sand. It is not force, but the patience of repeated curiosity. I allowed myself once to think of the day 10 years ago, when the key turned, and silence fell on a patch of ground that had known laughter. It is not my place to lay out other people's sorrows, and I shall not. But plants mourn in their way. Left to themselves, roses will throw blind shoots and thorns, and the earth will knit over what it can. We call it neglect, and imagine it neutral. It is not. It is a slow agreement to let living things live less. By the third week, the rope had made Mary's cheeks rounder. She took to wearing a cap that refused to stay straight on her head. And there is a time in every childhood when a crooked cap is the precise measure of new happiness. She asked once whether everything on the moor was trying to survive. I told her no. Some things are trying to sing, and some things are trying to eat the singers, and most are doing a little of both. She laughed, and I laughed, which is rarer for me than rain in August. But we still wonder whether the open wind is cure enough for rooms full of old tears, or whether the heart requires not only air and motion, but a door that swings outward to a place waiting to be loved. If you have ever thrown open a window after a long illness and found the room brighter than the sun outside, you will know the question is not foolish. Now and then a cloud would climb the sky like a heavy thought that cannot be shaken, and Mary's mouth would tighten as it used to when some small thing offended her. On such days I sent her to fetch twine from the shed, or to count the black slugs under the broken slates by the path. Simple tasks that give the hands occupation and the mind a narrow bridge to cross, without falling into itself. A kettle set to boil is a promise you can hold. A floor freshly swept across its grain is a small proof that effort alters the world. We are built to be encouraged by such homely evidence. Toward the end of that month, I noticed she had begun to carry her shoulders as if they belonged to her, not to an adult's idea of a child. The wind had named her, and she had answered not with a curtsy, but with a step that considered where it would fall and why. I make a business of not admiring too soon. Yet one evening, passing the east wall, I heard a sound so faint I might have missed it if the moor had not gone very still. It was ivy rubbing at metal, or metal remembering what it meant to be a keyhole, or perhaps the sound a thought makes when it finds its door. I chose not to turn my head. There are times when a man serves best by remaining an obstacle someone small learns how to go around. Call it pride or wisdom. Call it both. The robin observed my policy with approval, which is all the blessing I require. I went on trimming and muttering. The wind went on telling truths. Mary went on walking, roping, and naming. The house kept its old size. Above all this, the moor held steady like a great patient chest drawing breath for spring. Robins are small masters of ceremony. They announce arrivals, supervise departures, and keep a ledger of every crumb a human hand has ever spared. Mine is a veteran of a dozen winters, a gentleman in a russet waistcoat, and he took to Mary as he takes to any creature that looks as if it might be persuaded to listen. A child who has been starved of companionship will often pay attention to those who do not use words, and the robin speaks in skims, tilts, and glances, each as clear to me as any bell. That morning the frost was thin glass that would not hold a step. The lawns wore lace at their edges, and the sun was busy breaking it with a delicate patience. I had set myself to pruning late roses and making an honest apology to the canes for having left them 1 week too long. Mary came along the path with that rope of hers looped around her neck like a badge. She stopped where the robin stood on the rim of a broken pot and lifted her hand without haste. A creature will forgive clumsiness sooner than it forgives hurry. The bird flicked down, tested the air above her fingers, and decided she might be useful. I am not sentimental, but I am not blind. I saw the change in the set of her shoulders, the way her mouth relaxed as if it remembered smiling is allowed. She told me, in her plain, stiff way, that the robin had shown her a certain place by the ivy where the ground seemed different. I grunted and examined my secateurs as though they had become complicated. The fewer questions I asked, the more answers would come of their own accord. Children do better when you let them carry their own wonder without a grown man's weight on it. The robin carried on with his instruction. He flew to the long wall where the ivy gathers in thick folds, sat just low enough to vex a child, and then darted down to a spot where moss makes a green cushion over the old flagstones. He scratched twice, not out of need, but out of demonstration, and then cocked his head at Mary, as if to say that lessons are wasted on the dull. She knelt with a seriousness that would not have disgraced a vicar, and pressed the trowel's tip into the softness. It yielded the way bread yields when it is properly risen. You may think it silly, this adult attention to a child's game with moss. Yet in such small diggings histories turn. Beneath that cushion the soil was fine and dry, as though the sun had, against all reason, found a way to live under there. She loosened a crust, prized up a clump, and found the shallow suggestion of a hollow laid down by someone who had once taken care to hide a thing precisely where a bird might notice it first. I took a turn down the path just then, for it is not my custom to breathe over a moment that belongs to someone else. The sound of ivy shifting on old mortar followed me, and with it a memory of 10 years gone. I had been younger in my grumbling then, which is to say I had more of it and less right to it. A key had gone missing, or been made to disappear, depending on who told the tale. A door had stood to attention and then slept. The garden behind it, left to itself, had not died so much as withdrawn, like a person after a long sorrow who keeps company only with the weather. Mary called to the robin by name. She had given him one, as children do. And though I prefer the good plain word robin for a robin, the bird did not object. He hopped nearer and picked at the moss scrapings like a picky cook checking a stew. Mary, fired by this absurd partnership, set the trowel again and worried at the ground until the hollow admitted the shape of her patience. Her breath came in tight clouds. A lock of hair escaped her cap and would not be tamed. It is a soft knife to the heart to see childhood return where it had been dismissed. There are days in a gardener's year that stand out not because of bloom or harvest, but because of a shift in the air. This was such a day. I felt it in the way the fork bit the soil more sweetly than the week before, in the way the blackbirds kept to the hedges instead of raiding the beds, in the way the house itself seemed to lean a fraction less upon its own gloom. If the moor is a lung, Misselthwaite had begun to remember, breathing is a choice. Martha's voice blew across from the kitchen yard, bright as copper pans. She was scolding a cat with love disguised as roughness. The smell of bread drifted out, and I will confess, a man trimming canes in cold air will think better of the world if he knows there is a heel of fresh loaf waiting with a scraping of dripping. Mary did not look up. The rope swung against her side like a loyal hound waiting to be useful. A child at work is an emblem saints and poets overpraise, but it is also simply a good thing to see. If you have ever mended a glove by the fire and found your mood improved stitch by stitch, you will understand without fuss. At last, the trowel struck something that was not stone and not root. There is a note objects make when met by metal, and those who dig learn the tune. It was the sound of iron that has seen rain more often than hands. A dull, patient chime. Mary's face changed, not with victory, but with recognition, as if something inside her had said yes, before her mind had formed the word. She cleared more gently after that, as one would draw a sleeping child's blanket down from its chin. The thing she uncovered was small, curved, and the colour of old pennies left in a pocket through a wash. She did not cry out. She lifted it with both hands, and only then sat back on her heels. I stayed where I was and looked at the beds, which at that moment were the most fascinating beds any gardener ever saw. It is important, when the past rises in the present, to give it room to stand. The robin hopped onto Mary's knee, looked down at the object, and offered a short, opinionated flourish that I shall translate for you thus, about time. She wiped the dirt from the thing's face, and a hole appeared at one end and a ward at the other. A key looks like a promise and a warning both. Used too soon, it makes a mess. Used too late, it spoils into a superstition. Used rightly, it makes a way. She tucked it into the pocket of her coat as if she had always meant to carry it. Her chin went up a notch in that old manner of hers, but the haughtiness had turned into resolve. She looked once toward the place in the ivy where a door, if there was a door, would belong. The wall kept its counsel. Walls are good at that. She rose and brushed her knees and made of all things for the kitchen, where a glass of milk and a heel of bread might be found. Wisdom comes in odd orders. First the key, then the bread. The door when it likes. I met her on the path and gave the robin a nod, as though we shared a silent bargain. In truth, we did. Do not ask me to say more of what I knew then. A secret kept for a child is a greater courtesy than any bow. The garden had begun to lift its head under the ivy. A brace of snowdrops near the root of the old apple tree, proving that memory is not a prison when it is allowed to bloom. But we still wonder whether every found key should meet its lock, or whether some doors do their deepest healing by staying shut long enough for those who need them to grow hands gentle enough to turn them. If you have ever kept a letter sealed until your anger cooled, you will know why patience is not the enemy of happiness, but the gardener of it. That afternoon, I showed Mary how to test a stem for life, a thumb's press here, a nail's nick there, and how to hear the wet whisper that tells a cane it is ready to be cut back. We spoke little. Silence is not emptiness when a purpose fills it. Later, when the lamps were lit and the house had settled into its night complaints, there was, yes, the thin thread of weeping somewhere up in the bones of the place. Yet under it another sound began, so faint that I might have mistaken it for my own wishfulness. It was the scratch of metal against old paint, but it was not yet action. It was practice. The key had remembered there is such a thing as turning, and the door, if door there was, had stirred in its sleep. If you have a kitchen of your own, you might boil a kettle now and break a biscuit, and imagine the steam lifting the day's stiffness from your fingers. That is what Mary did in her way, with her pocket holding the weight of a future she could not name. I washed my hands at the pump and found the cold welcome. The robin settled his feathers and wedged himself against a warm bit of brick. We all made ready for a spring that had not yet announced itself, and yet had, in the way all true beginnings are both shy and certain. A key is a plain tool until it remembers its purpose. Then even an old bit of iron begins to carry itself like a word that has finally found its sentence. The morning after Mary tucked the thing into her pocket, the weather came soft, as if the moor had taken a warm breath and shared it with the stones. Mist lay low, the kind that does not hide so much as hush, and I went down the paths with my broom and my usual opinions. The robin kept abreast, bright as a coal in grey ash, and every so often he would skim to the east wall and rattle a leaf, as if to signal that the play would begin when the audience had taken their places. Mary arrived without ceremony, and yet with a caution that made ceremony of itself. Her mouth had lost its pinched look. I could tell she had slept with a hand in her pocket, or near to it, the way a person rests a palm on a book they mean to finish. She nodded to me in the way we had worked out, not stiff, not familiar, and made for the ivy. I stayed by the bed of hellebore, clipping back the last of the blackened leaves to give the pale blooms their due. You may think me a coward for not attending the very moment a child tries a key in a lock, but I have learned that the first conversation between metal and wood is not improved by an audience. She did not go straight at it. She walked once round that stretch of wall, the way a careful person sizes a horse before putting a foot in the stirrup. She pressed here and there in the ivy, testing for the hollows where mortar has given into years. There are places a wall keeps its secrets easily, and places where it grows absent-minded. I could have pointed them out. I did not. She cleared a small square with her fingers, exposing brick old as my knees. The mist made her hair damp and a little wild, and every so often she would stand back and look, not at her work, but at the shape of the idea itself, which is a rarer thing to see in a child than any flower. A door hidden in a wall does not become less a door for lack of visitors. Hinges remember. Wood keeps its grain even under ivy. If you know what to look for, you can see the faintest of lines where carpentry once told stone to make way. Mary found a place no bigger than my palm, where the ivy's hold loosened of its own accord. She worried it with patience, not force, and at last a tangle came free, its clinging roots giving with a small sigh. There, running vertical as a seam in a good coat, lay a line of difference that only the eye that has been trained by wanting can separate from the common wall. She stood very still. The robin hopped to her shoulder and then to the wall again. Manager and messenger both. I swept. The hellebore lifted their pale faces as if to approve of whatever would be done. In the far distance, a train sent a low note across the moor. Time makes such sounds to remind us it is passing whether we do anything worthy with it or not. Mary slid her hand into her pocket and brought out the key. She did not hold it up to the light. She kept it low, close, as if it might decide to fly away if shown off. She ran her thumb along the ward and touched the loop as though to ask it a question. Then she turned back to the seam in the wall and began to search for the place where a keyhole would hide. This is work for fingertips, not eyes. She traced along the brick, slow as a blind reader, and a small gasp escaped her when the pad of her finger dropped into a cool circle where iron had once greeted iron. I could feel the weight of the moment from 10 paces away, the way you feel thunder before it speaks. She knelt, set the key to the hole, and did not turn it. That was the right kind of wisdom. A lock, asleep a decade, wakes gently or not at all. She drew the key back, breathed on it, wiped it on her skirt, and tried again, easing it in with the attention one gives to threading a needle in failing light. The first test held. She withdrew once more and looked about her as if to ask the garden for permission. Gardens are not democracies. They do not vote, but they do consent or refuse in their own fashions. A little wind ran through the ivy. To some, it would have meant nothing. To a child who has found a key, it will always be a scent. She turned. The lock objected, then argued, then began to remember. There is a groan that old metal makes when it climbs out of its dream. I heard it. The hinge on the far side gave back a note of complaint. I heard that too. The seam widened the smallest fraction, no more than a breath, where a breath had not been permitted. Mary sat back on her heels and smiled, and in that smile was not triumph, but something quieter, as if she had been recognized by a place that had not spoken her name, and yet knew it. She did not open it. That is the glory of the moment. She did not fling it wide and rush in. She closed her hand over the key, rose, and went to walk a circuit of the garden paths, rope at her side, boots damp with mist. She came, after her little pilgrimage, to me. Without words, I handed her the broom so she could finish a sweep I had left on purpose. She took it solemnly and made of sweeping a rite. Work steadies joy the way a trellis steadies a new cane. You might think a broom a dull instrument for a child who has just found a hidden door, but the heart knows when to pause. Martha found us later with 2 mugs of something warm that tasted of spice and dared the tongue to complain about the chill. Mary sipped and stared at the east wall as if willing her eyes to grow through it. Martha, who knows more than she says, and says more than most know, told a story about Dickon teaching a crow to say good day. We laughed, and the mist lifted another inch. You would be surprised how much a laugh will move weather when it is offered from clean lungs. In the afternoon I showed Mary how to oil a hinge without announcing to the whole countryside that you have done so. We mixed a touch of grease with patience, and rubbed it into a rag until the rag carried the kindness without the glisten. She fetched me twine when I asked, and held a cane steady while I tied. All the while the key sat in her pocket, like a heartbeat she could hear whenever silence fell. I have known men lose their heads for less potent trinkets. Inside the house the old weeping rose once in the evening, and then stopped as if it too were listening for a new sound. When servants talk, they often mean no harm, but harm is in the world all the same, and a story told poorly grows thorns. Mary kept her counsel, I kept mine. The robin, if asked, would have claimed credit for the universe and not been entirely wrong. But we still wonder whether the right time to enter a long-closed room is when the key first fits, or when the heart can bear what it will find. If you have ever come upon a bundle of letters tied with string, and felt your fingers ache to untie them while your chest begged a minute more, you know that waiting can be a tenderness, not a denial. At dusk I walked the line of the kitchen garden and listened to the day settling. A thrush rang its evening bell. Smoke laid itself in low blue threads over the roof tiles. In my pocket I carried nothing but a bit of twine and the comfortable ache of work well done. In hers, Mary carried the shape of a future that belonged not to one child alone, but to a tangle of lives and roots and regrets that had been waiting for a small hand to grow steady. Night set its quiet foot on the paths. Lamps in the house made squares of gold upon stone. The moor lifted a star or two out of the seam of cloud. Tomorrow would have weather of its own, and the ivy would keep counsel for one more sleep. The door had moved enough to admit hope. The key had earned for the time being the dignity of restraint. I told the robin he was a pompous little king. He bowed as if I had knighted him, and then tucked his head under his wing. We were, all three of us, ready for whatever opening would next be asked of us. There are mornings when the whole world feels like it has pulled the quilt up to its chin and is pretending to sleep, while one eye peeks. The day Mary chose was one of those. The mist had burnt off to a pale shine, and the moor sent in a breath that smelled of wet stone and a promise not yet spoken aloud. I took the long path by the espaliered pears and made a professional display of inspecting a stake that had not moved in 3 seasons. The robin led Mary, or pretended to be led by her, toward the east wall. His breast was the brightest thing in sight, as if he had polished himself for the occasion. She did not hurry. A child in a rush is like a gardener with a dull blade, making more work of what ought to be clean. Mary laid her palm flat upon the ivy, the way a doctor lays a hand on a patient to feel more than he can see. Then she parted 2 drapes of leaves and knelt. The key came out of her pocket at the same speed as a thought that has decided to become a deed. She fitted it to the mouth she had found the day before. The lock argued once, then yielded like old bone remembering a dance. I heard a low creak that lived in both hinge and house, and the seam became a line, and the line opened into a small blackness that grew like the pupil of an eye turned toward light. She slipped through sidewise. She thinks herself solemn, but she is still small enough to pass where grown people must negotiate. The door closed after her without sound. The ivy fell back into its curtain with a polite little shake, as if to say no disturbance had occurred. If I had been a man for sentiment, I might have set my hat in my hands and murmured something to the bricks. I am not. I rummaged in my pocket for twine I did not need, and waited. Inside, though I did not see it then, lay the garden that for 10 years had been all winter and will. I had known it in leaf, in sorrow, and in neglect. But even in neglect, a garden chooses its manners. Roses stood like a regiment fallen into old age, canes grey and bristled. But at their feet the earth made small, brave declarations. Snowdrops raise their white lamps where they like, not where you plant them. And crocuses push through in little cups of flame, even when no one has set the table. Buds that would look like dead knobs to the untrained were tight with juice if you pressed just so. A robin will tell you these things if you have not the wit to see them for yourself. Mary stood among that sleeping company and did not speak. Later she told me, in her square way, that she had put out her hand and touched a cane, and felt the life run under its skin, like water under ice. I could have told her that is how March feels, not only to roses, but to a person returned to herself. She took in the shape of the beds, the stoop of the apple tree that had once held a summer seat, the arch where sweet peas had climbed when laughter was young in that place. There are histories plants keep without malice. A girl reading those pages may weep without knowing the half of why, and I would not call her foolish for it. I went on with my rounds. A man can busy himself with a rake and still hear what matters. The robin did not follow Mary in. He stayed with me, cheerfully insolent, as if to say that guides do not intrude upon their own success. He took a crust from my pocket. I swear I did not put there. And when I told him he was a thief, he replied with a string of notes that translated to the sound of a key laid upon earth. He was right. The sound carried. It was not loud, but it was exact, like a small coin laid on a clean table. You may suppose I presented myself for congratulations as soon as the door opened again. I did not. I swept the path to an unnecessary tidiness, and then found very important business in the tool shed. A secret belongs most fiercely to the first hour of its revelation, and a grown man can ruin that hour as clumsily as a boot on a bed of violets. In the shed I oiled a hinge that did not squeal, and wiped the excess off until the rag could not be accused of shining. I set a pot straight that had been crooked for 1.5 years. It is a comfort, when larger joys are at work, to do small righteous things with the hands. Mary was inside an age and 10 breaths. What did she do? Nothing that would make an exciting page in a newspaper. She walked the beds. She tested the stems. She lifted the corner of an old mat of straw and found underneath a ring where a pot used to sit, as tender a relic as any saint's. She cut nothing, for I had taught her that the first meeting between a novice and a resting rose is greeting, not surgery. She found under the apple tree a little congregation of green points, and said hello to each one, and I do not mind confessing that if anyone had been eavesdropping on me a few gardens over, they would have heard me answer with a cough that had no cough in it. At last the door breathed again and opened a fraction. She slipped out, cheeks bright with the kind of colour no rouge ever fakes, and closed it very softly, as if tucking a child back into bed. She saw me and did not start. We are past startling. She came up to me with the gravity of a little magistrate, and said she would require a small fork if it could be spared, and perhaps a bit of twine. She did not say what for. I did not ask. I went into the shed and brought her a fork sized for a hand that is learning, and the sort of twine that does not cut when you tie it fast. I also found a narrow trowel with a good edge. It is an odd feeling to outfit a person's happiness as if it were a job. Odd and very right. We took our tea on the step, the robin perched upon a low bar as if part of the staff. Mary ate bread with a seriousness that ought to be reserved for treaties. Warm liquid taken outdoors tastes better than any dining-room infusion. If you have ever buttered toast with the back of a spoon because the proper knife had gone missing and found the result perfectly satisfactory, you will understand the principle. Hospitality begins where strictness ends. She asked for advice without seeming to. How hard do you press to see if a cane is living? How much water for suckers that think more of themselves than of the plant? Whether bulbs resent being moved after they have committed to a direction. I gave her the recipes in measures no kitchen maid would recognize. Thumb weight, finger feel, the look of a good crumble when soil falls from roots. I might as well have told her about patience and kindness by their other names. In the house that evening the old weeping came once and then, as if it, too, had paused on a threshold, softened. I have no science to offer for that. I merely state what a man of attentive habits heard. Martha hummed in the scullery. The lamps made their domestic squares upon stone. Even the moor, which keeps its own counsel, seemed to hold its breath a moment longer in the afterglow. But we still wonder whether a place loved in secret grows stronger for the secrecy, or whether love must, in the end, come to light to finish its work. If you have ever kept a gift hidden until a birthday and felt it sweeten in the keeping, even as it begged to be given, you know the argument on both sides. Before she turned in, Mary came to me again and announced, with that straight little way of hers, that she intended to be busy every day, that she would not be cross if the weather proved rude, and that she would require, on occasion, the loan of a knife stern enough to cut dead wood, and yet clever enough to spare what means to live. I told her such knives exist and must be earned. She tried to look offended and could not manage it. The truth of respect had already taken hold. When at last I stood alone, I took a turn past the east wall. The ivy hung as it had always hung, ordinary as laundry on a Tuesday, but the air on that side of the path had tempered. You might have said a kettle had been set to sing on the far side of the bricks, not loud enough to hear, but certain enough to warm your hands if you laid them to the stone. The robin called me a slow old lump in his fashion, and I called him a peacock, which for a robin is high insult and compliment both. He puffed and preened, and then went to roost with the night. I locked the shed and pocketed nothing but a bit of string. The key lay where it ought, against the child's heart. The door, after 10 years, had become what all rightful doors become. Not a barrier, not a shrine, but a way. Tomorrow there would be dirt under nails, and the bite of cold on early fingers, and small triumphs no one would think to applaud. That is how healing goes about its business. Quiet as root work, steady as sap, sure as the first green tip pushing up where someone once thought everything had ended. Spring is a shy guest at first, peering round the door jamb to see if the room suits. Then, finding it does, she walks in with her sleeves rolled and sets every clock in the house 5 minutes fast. That was the week a lad came whistling over the moor with a ferret of a smile, a bundle of switches and string, and the sort of trust from birds and beasts you cannot purchase with seed. Dickon Sowerby is his name, Martha's brother, and I will say this for him, though praise does not easily pass my lips. He carries with him the health of the open air, the way a hearth carries heat. Creatures that would bolt from the rest of us examine him as if he were their cousin. I have seen a fox sit and listen to his talk, as if attending a sermon it had particularly requested. Mary met him at the edge of the copse, where the wind slows to think. She had dirt on her hands and pride in her posture. 2 good signs I had been waiting to see together. He came with a young crow riding his shoulder like a sailor, and a wild look that is not unhandsome when strapped to kindness. The dialect runs in him as gravy runs into a good crust. And before 10 minutes had gone, the child who used to turn up her small nose at anything not polished began to smile at sounds that would have confused her a month before. There are languages in England older than Latin and kinder than etiquette. The Moor speaks one, Dickon speaks another. Mary was learning both. I kept my distance. Surly men are not improved by audience. But I saw. He showed her how to set a hand under a root ball without bruising it, how to loosen a pot-bound plant the way you would loosen a tight thought, by easing each side in turn until the middle yields. He put a bit of sugar on his tongue and whistled in a way that brought a squirrel out to scold him with unnecessary intimacy. He saw what I see in the child, that stubborn green under old frost, and he greeted it without ceremony. Good gardeners never fuss over what is doing right by itself. In the secret place, the garden had begun to breathe audibly. Buds fattened, a thing you can miss if you only ever look for flowers. The apple tree remembered its trick of standing like an old friendly umbrella. Under it, the soil, which had sulked a decade, took a long drink of the light that filtered through the opening Mary kept clear. The 2 children came and went like apprentices who have stolen their master's ledger and intend to make honest entries. They weeded in the soft, distracted way beginners do, and I, coming at odd hours with nothing to declare, set back a stake here, tested a tie there, and returned tools that had strangely wandered to the right hook. A garden forgives clumsy affection, but it thrives on quiet competence. I supplied what quiet I could. You ask for a detail from the old tale. Here is one with the breath still on it. The robin, my familiar, took to Dickon as surely as he had adopted Mary, and led us to a tangle where once a rose of deep habit had been trained along an arch. The arch stood yet, ashamed of itself under ivy. Mary touched the cane, as she had learned, and found life along the lowest length, sap whispering under bark as thin as paper. We set to the slow rescue, dead wood off to make light, tie in where shoots had made an argument with gravity, the obedient snip and the merciful stay of the hand. When the last length lay right, the air changed in that square of garden, as if someone had opened a window. It is not poetry to say so. Ask any pruner worth her salt. Dickon is a boy who carries pocketfuls of small miracles and does not crowd them. He brought a handful of seeds he liked for their cheerfulness, and showed Mary how to rake a bed to the texture of crumbs. He lined a row with twine taught as a good intention, and pressed each seed with a thoughtful finger, not poking but tucking, as one tucks covers under a sleeping child. He told her to speak to them without fuss, and leave the rest to weather and time. She accepted the instruction with the solemn ease of one who has discovered duty is another name for joy. We took our dinners indifferently where they found us. A roll with cheese never tasted finer than on a low wall with a robin staring you down as if to assess the fairness of your bite. When you eat out of doors, a humble wrap becomes a feast simply by knowing the sky's opinion of it. I have lived long enough to recommend a plain sandwich on a chilly bench as a cure for a mind that has talked itself into a corner. A mug that scalds your fingers a little is worth more than a philosopher on certain days. Mary, who once measured a day by its disappointments, began to measure it by tasks completed. This many weeds lifted without tearing the roots of the good neighbours. That many clumps divided and replanted, each with a drink to settle the shock. She quarrelled less with small stones and more with her own haste. She learned that a cane tied two tight sulks, and one tied two loose sulks differently. She laughed 3 times in one afternoon, and then looked astonished that she had. I made a note of it in my private calendar, a better sign of weather than any barometer I own. At the house, the thin sound that had drifted at night from upper corridors became less insistent. Not gone, but altering, as a bird's call alters when it finds company. Mary slept the sleep of those who have air in their lungs and a plan in the morning. Martha, who possesses more sense than all the books in the library stacked up and shooed into a bonnet, left a paper-wrapped parcel on the step from her mother, brown scones and a dab of something tart. It disappeared between the 3 of us as though a hedgehog had declared its rights and been obeyed. You will say I play the gruff man's game too hard, pretending indifference while contriving coincidence. Perhaps. But even a stubborn old stick like me knows when his hands are wanted. I recut a border the children had drawn over wavy, the way a beginner writes her name too large on a page, then smoothed it until the eye could settle and rest. I found them a small knife, stern but clever, and made Mary promise, with that stiff nod of hers, to cut only what cannot live, and to doubt her judgment before doubting the plants. Doubt is not an enemy when it keeps your hand from harm, but we still wonder whether tending what is hidden can heal what is seen, or whether the heart must carry its rescue into the open sooner or later, or else grow cramped by secrecy. If you have ever nursed a plan in your pocket, and found it warming your whole self like a stone heated in a fire, you know the sweetness and the danger of keeping good news under your coat. On lighter matters, Dickon taught Mary to whistle a small phrase that makes thrushes cock their heads as if debating whether to answer, and I found myself practicing it when I thought no one looked. There is no law against an old man embarking on a new foolishness if it harms none. Also, I will confess this much in the safe company of honest people. I once wiped my boots on the back of my own trouser leg rather than track dirt into the house, and felt a boyish pride fit for a captain returning from sea. Small victories, like young shoots, encourage more of their kind. By week's end, the hidden place was no longer all winter. A piece of border, clean and edged, made a picture frame for bare ground, full of future. A rose that had drooped under the tyranny of its own weight stood easier for one length tied kindly to a stake. Under the apple boughs, something green that had not dared last year, now dared. You could feel the ground making a low, contented sound if your boots were thin and your heart kept decent company. I walked home late with tools that had done honest work and a back that corrected my vanity for me with a twinge or two. The moor lay out like a dark, breathing animal, unafraid of night. Behind me, in a square of wall that looks like any other, there was the slow shift and stir of a place remembering its name. Tomorrow would bring more making right, more learning. Perhaps a disappointment or two, since disappointment is part of any long friendship with the living world. But tonight there was a pot to set near the fire, and a slice of cheese, and the mild astonishment that comes to a man who has been sullen too long and discovers his mouth has learned to shape a tune. There is a kind of silence that is not empty but full of agreement. You feel it in a workshop when each hand knows its task, and no one needs to say, "Mind the plane," or "Fetch the nails." That was the air between us once the children had made their whispers into a rule. No telling, no prying, no parading what breathes better, kept from gawkers. I have never put much stock in promises made loud, but a quiet one, spoken to a wall and a robin, will hold a soul steadier than a ribbon and seal. Mary came to me the next morning with a look I had seen on grown men before harvest, the look of someone who has found out what hours are for. She did not preen with pride or skulk with guilt. She simply held herself, as if a string had been tied from the top of her head to a beam in the rafters and trimmed taut. Dickon arrived with a bag that would have puzzled a customs man and the frank conscience of a boy who does more good than he can count. We did not shake hands on anything. We did not draw up a plan. The robin saluted, which is quite enough ceremony for a conspiracy. The law of our gentle silence had its articles. No one but us three and the creatures admitted. No tools borrowed without returning them to their rightful hooks in the shed. No boasting beyond the ivy. No grim talk of what was lost. The past was to be honoured by present usefulness, not rehearsed until it soured. If something living stood a chance, our hands must give it that chance. If something had gone to its rest, we would bury, not argue. I have worked under worse bosses than a rule-book so plain. Mary observed it with a care that would have made a vicar satisfied. She had been trained in other sorts of propriety, the kind that looks well in a drawing-room and does a child no good when she is alone. This new manner suited her. She arrived early enough to see the light come in sideways and set a shine on the damp threads of ivy. She rolled back her sleeves without one glance toward whether the fabric minded and set to. The little fork worked its education on her hands. Dirt left its dark upon her palms, and her face brightened at the gift. Dickon whistled like a kettle that never burns dry. He taught Mary to read what weather intends by the taste of the air and the shine on the backs of leaves. He pointed out where a wren had stitched a nest into the thorn and told her to walk wide of it, not because it is rare, but because it is ordinary. He says that with a reverence that improves a person to hear. He brought buttermilk in a jar and oat cakes that had the good sense to be a little coarse, and Mary ate as if the moor had made her appetite itself. In the secret place we worked by the laws that any decent piece of ground will teach its stewards if they keep still long enough to learn. Cut what is dead, not what is slow. Tie what leans, do not scold it. Rake to crumbs, but not to dust. When the earth clings to the root as a friend, let them cling. When it shakes off like a coat too heavy for the day, let it fall. We lifted a mat of matted straw and found underneath the pale tips of hyacinth shouldering toward air. Mary's eyes went round at the colour the bulbs already held. She set the mat aside as if it were a blanket from a sickbed, and went to fetch a watering can with the brisk step of a nurse. I kept my gruffness like a coat I had not the heart to discard. There is comfort in old garments, even when they do not fit the way they used to. I asked for twine, in a tone that makes a child think she ought to hurry, then thanked her with a nod that says, "You are capable." She returned more than twine. She returned attention. When I told her to hold a cane steady with one hand and test the give with 2 fingers of the other, she did not argue or improve upon the instruction. She held and listened, and the cane told her its truth. This is more than I have been able to teach many an adult who comes at roses as if they were arithmetic. From the house, the thin sound that had once run the passages like a chill grew less sharp. The servants said the weather was turning. Martha said nothing beyond what served kindness. But I saw Mary once, pausing at a window on an errand and listening with her whole small body for the cry that had ruled the nights. What she heard that minute I cannot swear to, but she returned to the garden with a face resolved to be brave. Children do not grow up all at once. They grow in little rightnesses caught and kept. There is a detail from the old story that belongs here. Mary, who used to throw away bread, now saved crusts in a pocket for the robin and his opinionated kin. She offered one on her palm, flat and steady, like a ledge built for a small king. The robin took it without ceremony and left a crumb on her sleeve as receipt. It is a foolish thing to love a bird, and yet there are foolishnesses that correct the soul as neatly as pruning corrects a cane. I will not apologize for calling it holy work. We struck our bargains with weather. On days when the wind pushed hornet hard over the wall, we kept low and mended ties. On mild afternoons, we raked beds and laughed at nothing, until the nothing became everything that needed to be said. I sent Mary to count the daisies in a patch, and watched her learn the lesson the flowers teach better than any man. They come simple and many, and they refuse grandness, and their refusal is their triumph. By evening she had taken on a little of their grace. Dickon, for all his lightness, observed the law as strictly as any magistrate. When a gardener grows by a hidden door, there is a sort of magic people like to name and name until it is all name and no work. He would have none of that. He told Mary that the moor is cure for those who let it, that joy has rules as much as sorrow does, and that the smallest kindnesses must be done as quietly as seeds are sown. He said it with the cheer of a boy who knows each rule is a key to one more gladness. She believed him because she could try each one within the hour and find it true. We kept the gate shut behind us with the tenderness one gives to a sleeping child's door. The ivy fell back each time as if it approved the manners of our coming and going. I added oil in doses the wall would never tattle about, and in return the hinge gave only a sigh fit for a church at even light. There is a craft to secrecy that has nothing to do with shame and everything to do with loving what would be spoiled by spectacle. But we still wonder whether a vow spoken low can carry farther than a shout, and whether the things we guard in the shade grow strong enough to bear the noon. If you have ever kept a surprise supper warm and watched the faces of your own when you lifted the cloth and set the dish down, you know how protection and revelation take turns and bless each other if timing is right. To ease the day, I will offer you homely wisdom I learned again, standing with those two. A mug carried to a companion's hand is as good as a sermon. A path swept at the end of work helps tomorrow begin without apology. A slice of cheese shared on a crate tastes better than a private dainty on a silver plate. If you have a kitchen, boil a kettle and let the steam make a small weather of its own. If you have a doorstep, sit on it 5 minutes and count birds, and your mind will find its level as water finds the spirit in a glass. The garden answered our careful compact. The arch we had freed took light on its spine, as if a hand had moved a heavy thought from its back. The apple tree promised shade it did not yet possess, and was forgiven for the delay. The borders, once a tangle of old intent, began to carry a new grammar. Nothing is more hopeful than a clear edge beside a clean bed. It says to the eye and the heart, this piece of earth is not asked to be everything, only what it is. When the lamps came on in the big house, the ivy took the glow and held it like a memory it would not share. I walked past with the late tools and saw my own shadow stand straighter than my back would normally allow. Work had put a polish on the day. The robin scolded me for dawdling and then allowed me the favour of escort until the shed door took its latch. I am not a man given to gratitude in public, but in private I placed one palm upon the rough boards and let the thanks out under my breath, where it belongs. Night smoothed the roofs and asked no questions. Tomorrow would test our law, as all good laws must be tested, and we would hold it or mend it where it frayed. For now the hush was honourable. A secret worth keeping had begun to keep us. The child who once spoke only to command had learned to ask. The boy who speaks to beasts had taught us both to listen, and I, who thought myself only a guardian of walls and weather, found I had been keeping watch also over a promise I never made aloud, and am glad to have obeyed. Nights in a big house have a way of speaking to those who patrol its edges. The moor hums its old bass outside, and within pipes settle, beams give little sighs, and sometimes a note thinner than steam slips along the passages and makes a man stop with his key half raised. I had heard that note often enough these 10 years to mistake it for weather. Habit will lie to you, kindly and for too long. That evening the sound had a different temper, as if the wind itself had put a hand over its mouth to listen. I set down the coil of twine I had no reason to carry at that hour, and looked up at the long back of Misselthwaite with its lit squares like watchful eyes. Mary had learned the house as she learned the garden, by walking it until her feet could tell the turns. Martha says the child minds her own business when business is set before her, and invents some when it is not. I heard later how the corridor had pooled a little lamp glow at a bend, and how, out of that warmth, The thin crying rose and fell, like something being tugged loose and tied again. The staff will tell you a moaning flue is a flue. The child followed the sound as if it were a robin's call to an old wall. There is a room high up where the air forgets its manners, stuffed with thick curtains that keep out draughts and daylight with equal zeal. In the middle of it stands a bed with carved posts that have listened to every whisper of this house since before my grandfather trimmed a hedge. The curtains fall close as a doctor's fingers around a wrist, and behind them, on a pillow plumped out of duty more than hope, lay Master Colin Craven, the boy who has been a rumour and a regimen and a reason for hushes since he came into the world. I did not see Mary part those curtains, but I can see her mind doing it. She had the look of a girl who had learned that some doors open when you push, and some when you ask, and some when you simply stand and wait until they forget they are doors. The nurse, fierce with righteousness and weariness, had gone off on an errand. Mrs. Medlock, who keeps the house with a hand like a locked drawer, had assumed sleep where there was only the habit of it. The child stepped forward. A boy's eyes, grey with too much ceiling and too few horizons, met a girl's that smelled of earth and air. They startled one another properly, I am told, each having believed himself or herself the only ghost under that roof. He flared first, as those shut up with their own fear often do. He told her he would be a hunchback, that he would die young, that breath and bone were conspirators against him, and he had signed the confession already. He spoke of Dr. Craven with dread that wore the mask of reverence, and of his father with a silence that opened like a hole in the floor between them. Children are not stupid. They know when love has gone to more length, and they call the emptiness by as many names as it takes to be born. Mary, who once rationed her kindness like sugar in wartime, did not ration this. She snapped back, not cruel, but clean. She told him the moor blows sense into tight places. She told him of a robin with management in his eye, and a wall with a seam and a key you do not use until your hand is steady. She told him of earth that answers to care, and of a fork made for a hand that is learning. She did not say secret. She did not say magic. She spoke as nurses do when they mean to see you better and cannot afford your fancies. I have known sermons less useful. You want a scrap from the old tale. Here is one that belongs exactly here. There is a portrait in that room, the face of his mother, bright with the kind of living that makes rooms lighter whether lamps are lit or not. The boy keeps it where he can see it without moving his head much. He loves it and fears it and argues with it when everyone else is asleep. Mary looked at that face and then at his, and something in her put two and two together and came up with the sum that has mended more mischief than any doctor. To bring a person outdoors where sky can get at them and wind can rinse their opinions. I did not stand in that room. I stood on stone a world away, watching the ivy hold the night as if it could keep it from slipping, and I heard the house's thin cry falter and smooth. In the morning, Martha came round by the sheds with a look she saves for news too good to be told, all at once. "He's a peevish as a raw thorn," she said, but she didn't scare, and I knew then the true hinge of our story had moved. There is an anger that keeps a boy upright when his legs have not yet remembered they belong to him. Colin displayed it like a banner that first meeting. Mary did not salute. That suited me. I have no use for tempers that blow everything down. The kind I respect knows when to fill a sail and when to let it luff. Before the day was done, the child had bullied him with honesty into sitting up without the ceremony of pity. That is a better tonic than anything in a brown bottle. The nurse returned and squawked. Mrs. Medlock fluttered and tightened doors in her mind. The boy learned there is such a thing as a quarrel worth having. I passed that afternoon under a window I had no right to linger near, and a sparrow dropped a bit of plaster on my cap for my trouble. Still, the voices from the high room came not like cries, but like weather breaking. He demanded more stories of the moor. She obliged with details plain as a seed catalogue. Dickon's crow, who says good day and means give me your bread. The smell of peat when the mist lifts. The feel of a cane under the thumb when sap is on the move. He asked if a person as crooked as he believed himself could become straight like a young hawthorn in May. She answered the only answer that does not lie. We will see, and we will work, and we will not borrow trouble from next week. Toward evening, the household walked careful as cats around China. Dr. Craven made his rounds with professional gravity and a private Paul. He spoke of spines and hearts and inheritance as if fate were a ledger, and the boy an entry already tallied. I have lost patience with men who speak so, even when they do it with clean hands and a decent coat. Plants have taught me what such talk forgets. Life takes a chance when chance is offered, and it does not always consult your notebooks. The doctor left behind a stricter nurse and a room full of rules. He could not, for all his learning, bar the true draught that had found a way into that place. It came in the company of a girl with mud honest on her cuffs. But we still wonder whether a cry that has governed a house can be coaxed into a song by company alone, or whether it must be carried into open air and taught the shapes of joy under a wider roof. If you have ever opened a window after a long sulk and felt your bad mood go out like steam leaving a kettle, you know how air does half a healer's work before the bottle comes out. To make the evening kinder, I will give you homely prescriptions that cost nothing and cure much. Butter a heel of yesterday's loaf and eat it standing in a doorway. The crumb will taste like courage. Put the kettle on even if you do not want tea. The sound of the boil will remind your breath how to move. Sweep one small square of floor. The room will look no different to others, and your mind will, and that is the point. If you have a bit of string in your pocket, tie something right that is leaning wrong. Your heart will take the hint. That night, while the house settled, the ivy at the east wall held a memory of day that felt like a hand laid lightly on a brow. In his high room, the boy lay with eyes open not to the dark, but to an idea the dark could not frighten. In her narrow bed, the girl held her own counsel as if it were a robin's egg, and I, the old watcher of walls, knew we had crossed from rumour into work. Tomorrow would test us. Weather always does. But the sound that drifted down the stairwells was no longer complaint. It was the first careful attempt at a tune. Candles make an honest kind of light. They admit they are only a small sun, and because they do not pretend to be more, they steady the nerves of a room. That night, a flame the size of a robin's heart slipped along a corridor and paused where the air turns inward. I was below, near the door to the kitchen yard, setting a latch to rights for the third time in a week on the respectable excuse that iron knows my hand. A house has ways of telling its secrets to those who mend it. The hush above me had a different weight, as if the passage itself were waiting to hear a decision. Mary had taken to visiting Colin in the late hours when nurse and rule both drowse. She went not as a supplicant or a scold, but as a bearer of weather. She carried into that heavy room the smell of damp leaf and clean earth, the very sound of the moor in the crease of her skirt. The candle pooled a circle on the counterpane, and in that small daylight she set about doing what gardeners do anywhere they find themselves. She named what lived. She told him of the arch we had freed of its shame, of a cane that had remembered the trick of rising with a little help and a kind tie. She told him of snowdrops lifting their white bells like a row of small handkerchiefs waved at a departing sorrow. She told him of bulbs that had seemed no better than crumpled onions, and were now pushing green spearheads through a crust of old straw. She said none of this with that talk people put on when they wish to enchant. She spoke as a nurse records a temperature that has at last begun to fall, calm and exact. The boy lay back and let those details do what medicine could not. Fear had trained his lungs to be poor companions. In that wavering circle of light he practiced the deeper breath any gardener takes without being told, the one that begins in the belly and ends with a small, unboastful relief. I am told he asked if the garden had a place for a person who could not stand up. It is exactly the sort of question roses answer without speeches. A bed welcomes you, whether you kneel or stoop or sit beside it with your hands in your pockets. Mary gave him the promise I respect most, the promise that binds the promiser as sternly as it comforts the one who hears it. We will try. From my corner I could mark the house's temper loosening a stitch. Servants' doors breathed instead of gritting their teeth. The wisp of crying that had ruled the hours between lamps and dawn shrank into doubt and edged toward quiet. A thrush outside the long landing window tried a phrase or two that sounded like rehearsal rather than lament. I have watched weather break the same way, not with a clap, but with the feel of a man loosening his collar before he knows why. Mary, being not one for performances, did not say the word secret aloud. Yet the flame upon the candle made the truth of it dance on the boy's ceiling. She told him of the robin's brisk governance and of a door that answers to patience more than to push. She described the key with its old penny face and the lock that had groaned itself awake after a decade of sleep. When he asked if a person might come there with wheels instead of legs, she said that the paths would take some clearing and the gate some coaxing, and that if he could bear a bump or two, the garden would bear him. There is a detail from the story's old bones worth laying here. The nurse, stern in her duty and frightened of calamity, kept a tray of brown glass bottles and the habit of counting breaths as if tallying sins. In that first true evening of change she came in ready to protest, and found, to her astonishment, not a boy gnawed by dread, but a boy intent upon a candle, and a girl telling the news of green things with a clerk's accuracy and a sister's warmth. The nurse set down her tray more quietly than her hands are wont, and when she left, it was on the ball of her foot. Even worry will bend its head to such a scene. While Mary spoke, I tended a hinge at the east wall, the one Ivy likes to sing against after rain. I added one more ghost's breath of oil, and work the pin until it answered with only the smallest civil sigh. You may call it meddling. I call it laying out a smooth step for a frail foot that has too long been told the stair is impossible. A gate that opens easily sends courage into the spine of whoever touches it, and we had need of all the courage we could coax. The boy asked for proofs such as children trust. What colour would come first, and whether the apple tree had any of last year's bird nests left in its elbows, and if a person sitting low could still smell the thyme that spreads like a good rumour under the bench. Mary answered him like a gardener, which is to say she made room for surprise. Yellow first, most likely, and yes, the nests are there unless the wind has bargained them away, and time is democratic enough to lift for anyone who cares to bend near and ask. You who have not pushed a chair with a living boy in it may not know the bravery a plan demands before it becomes a deed. The first part of the plot was homely. Martha would play the general in the passage, clearing a path with her talk of laundry and airing linen. I would make a show near the side door with a wheelbarrow and a quarrel about gravel that required Mrs. Medlock's eye at the far end of the hall. Dickon would meet us where the paving dips, with a crust to lay before the robin as a distraction and a joke ready for any gardener who looked as if he meant to ask questions. The second part was simpler still. A blanket, a chair, a boy, a key, a gate that would be kind, and the garden itself, which, if it could, would take him up like water takes a thrown stone. But we still wonder whether the smallest light can hold its own against a houseful of habits, or whether the patient work of naming and tending must be joined by a bolder act to finish the cure. If you have ever left a lamp in a dark room for a child, and come back to find not only the child asleep, but the room gentled, you will not scold me for believing candles do more than show where we are. They suggest who we might be. To ease the weight of schemes, let me offer you common advice tested in rooms like this. Put the kettle on before you worry. The sound of water becoming steam will shorten your fretting by half. Straighten a small stack of plates or fold 2 towels. You will learn again the truth that order is not pride, but mercy. If you can spare it, keep a crust for a bird, and the habit of giving for yourself. Better spirits are won in kitchens than in parlours, when a house is trying to remember its courage. By the end of that hour, Mary had told him about the rope that had taught her lungs to be brave, about the way the moor slaps sulkiness out of a person as gently as you slap dust from a cushion, about Dickon's crow with his impertinent good day that never fails to snatch a smile. Colin listened with a hunger that had nothing to do with dinner. He let the candle burn down until the pool of light was a bright coin on the bedspread. Then he said what needed saying. Tomorrow. A small word is sometimes the strongest. Tomorrow meant truth-telling in the morning to a nurse who would think the sky itself a hazard, and to Mrs. Medlock, whose loyalty to rules is as complicated and honourable as any courage. Tomorrow meant testing wheels on uneven floor and smuggling along a blanket more for ceremony than for cold. Tomorrow meant a gate that would not squeal betrayal, and a door that would open to a boy who had been, until that hour, a room thinking itself a fate. I snuffed my lantern and stood still, letting the dark settle my plans until they felt like tools in a tidy shed. The moor beyond the walls breathed deep enough to be heard. The robin, insolent as ever, found a warmer brick, and scolded the night as if it had not dressed itself properly. In a room above, a candle went out because it had done its work. The air did not fall back into gloom. It held its new shape the way a stem holds the curve a careful tie teaches it to love. Morning would ask for steadier hands than any sermon, and we had them ready. A girl with soil under her nails, a boy with a name he had not yet used out loud for hope, a lad from the moor whose pockets jingle with good mischief, and an old gardener who knows which hinges prefer to be thanked in silence. I slept that night not as long as a wise man ought, but deeply enough to wake with the useful thought first. The broom by the east path would do for smoothing tracks, and the oil rag should be folded small in my sleeve. When a house and a garden agree on a plan, the ground itself feels kinder underfoot. Morning came up honest and practical, the sort of light that expects you to have your boots on before it wastes itself on your windows. I was at the east path with the broom I had thought of in the night, taking the ripple out of the gravel where a chair's wheel might balk. The robin inspected every stroke as if I were alphabetizing crumbs. From the house came the rustle that means breakfast for those who take it in bed, and the clatter that means Martha is proving to the crockery who is master. We had made a plan, and we meant to walk through it without waking more fear than was already alert. Martha's part was talk. She could make a procession of laundry sound like a royal visit, and that is how she filled the passage with harmless bustle. The nurse, who counts threats as if they were pearls, went to straighten sheets that did not need straightening. Mrs. Medlock, called to the far end of the hall by a small emergency of dripping taps and my borrowed wheelbarrow, attended to dignity. I stood by the side door with a handkerchief of oil in my sleeve, and the hinge that likes to complain already softened to civility. Dickon came over the moor with the kind of weather round him that cannot be measured by barometer. He had a mischievous crust for the robin, and a look that said the world would be well if it only remembered how. Mary met him at the turn, with a blanket over her arm and the set to her jaw that told me she had slept with her decision under the pillow, and woken with it in her fist. Between them, rolling in a chair with wheels that had never once carried him farther than the width of a room, came Master Colin Craven, pale as the underside of a leaf, and as likely to green if not frightened into self-doubt. "You will want particulars." The boy's hands gripped the arms of the chair at first, as sailors grip rails in a new sea. The wheels complained on the flags, and then learned the path's grammar. When he breathed, you could see him searching the air, as if for a taste the nurse had not bottled. Mary walked beside him, her palm ready on the blanket, not for show, but for steadiness. Dickon took the handles with a touch that would not frighten a foal. I went ahead to open what needed opening and to look like nothing at all to anyone who might be looking. The side door obeyed, as if eager to prove itself. The hinge gave only the sigh of a polite person stepping aside. Outside, the moor had trimmed its voice to a hum a boy might bear. We crossed the yard, a plain piece of ground that had seen more comings and goings than the family Bible, and turned along the sheltered walk where the sun creeps earliest. A blackbird announced us with a sort of impertinent question. Birds ask when people do what they ought to have done sooner. No one answered him. The garden wall had our full attention. Ivy can look like a mere tangle to the hurried, but to those who trust their hands, it is a curtain with good manners. Mary went first to the seam and gave it the touch that says not now to panic and yes to courage. The key came out, ordinary as a spoon and every bit as necessary. She set it to the lock, and because I had worked the iron's memory for it, the old thing did not argue long. The crack opened like a smile restrained by shyness. Dickon eased the chair. The front wheel hesitated at the threshold, then decided it was born to cross thresholds after all. The boy held his breath without meaning to. I did the same on purpose. Inside, the air held that sweetness gardens keep for those who have asked properly. The apple tree made a lean canopy of gentleness. Snowdrops and crocus showed their white and gold, as if the place were laying the table for a guest it had longed for, but not dared to expect. The chair settled on the path as neatly as a boat in its slip. Mary knelt at once, the blanket forgotten, and touched a cane at its lowest length where life runs, even when the top looks dead. She looked up at him and said, with her eyes what good gardeners say with their hands, "You are among allies." He sat very still. That is not easily done when every part of you expects the air to betray you. His face changed in increments, the sort of small shift you notice only if you have spent a life seeing whether a bud means to open or to fail. Dickon put a bit of thyme between his fingers and told him to rub. The boy did as told, and the smell rose with that clean domestic cheer herbs, keep for kitchens and for sorrow. His shoulders, which had learned to live like shutters in a storm, loosened one slat. He breathed again and found the breath worth keeping. For your beloved scrap of the old story, I hand you this. He said not that word people throw at anything they cannot name, but a very plain boy's promise. He would come again tomorrow. He would train his lungs like a sensible apprentice trains his hand. He would incline himself toward health the way a cane inclines toward a stake tied kindly. He was not cured. He was interested in the work of living. That is better. We made no speeches. Work looks back at ceremony the way a cat looks at a mirror. I showed him with 2 fingers how a stem will tell you the truth if you press near the node and listen with your thumb. He tried it, awkward at first. Then, with that eagerness the body keeps even when it has been scolded into thinking itself poor. Mary fetched the small fork. Dickon pointed out the run where last year's hedgehog had kept his parliament. We kept him still in the chair longer than his temper liked, and when he bristled, it was the bristle of a boy tired, not a soul terrified. That difference is as great as moor to city. I will confess a vanity. The robin chose that hour to practice his lecture upon us all. He perched on the arch we had rescued and gave a paragraph of notes that translated as a commendation and a demand for crumbs. Mary produced a pocket's evidence of thrift. The bird accepted the crust and left the customary receipt in crumbs upon the boy's blanket. Colin looked at that mess as if it were a medal. You may laugh. Laughter suits the scene. We stayed just long enough to make the place familiar without letting weariness turn victory sour. Dickon backed the chair with care, and we crossed the threshold again into the world that had not altered and yet had. The door closed without boasting. The ivy shook itself into order. On the walk back, the boy dozed and woke and dozed again. A 3-part lesson in trust. Martha's campaign in the corridors held long enough for us to wheel him into his room, with only the ordinary amount of cluck and frown. From those paid to protect the fragile. In the afternoon he sent for fresh air, the way some send for books. The nurse measured his pulse and found it obstinate in the best direction. She muttered, but her hands arranged his pillows with a light that had not been there yesterday. Dr. Craven, all correctness and foreboding, arrived later than his habit, and found a patient who wanted particulars about rakes and whether a human spine could learn from applewood. He recommended caution in a tone that meant prohibition. The boy, polite, filed the advice under things to consult weather about. But we still wonder whether courage should be smuggled in on small wheels or marched through the front with a band, and whether a life long kept indoors needs permission as much as air. If you have ever carried a chair to the threshold and eaten your supper with your knees under the sky, you know that the world does not ask for trumpets before it offers you its plain feast. To ease the telling, let me give you homely measures that held for us. Put a shawl in the sun for 5 minutes before you wrap a tired person in it. The warmth will convince the body before the mind has time to object. Keep a jug of water where hands can reach it without asking. Thirst cured kindly makes better manners than scolding ever will. Sweep the track you mean to take twice, once for pride and once for luck. Tell no one you are hoping. Show them the work and let hope be the smell they cannot quite name. By evening the house had the look of a place that has been visited by honest weather. The thin cry did not come down the stairwells. In its place drifted the faintest scrap of humming from an upper room, where a boy, tired as a new gardener, thought about time and snowdrops until sleep took him before fear could. Mary ate her bread like a soldier, and then sat on the step with her chin in her hand, as if reviewing troops she meant to command with kindness. Dickon went off across the moor, with a fox's track choosing him for company. I locked the shed and put my palm on the door, a habit I shall not excuse, and said the kind of thanks a man says when his day has been better than he deserved. Tomorrow would sharpen our duties, paths would need widening. Hinge and heart both would need oil. We would find how far a chair can go on gravel, without setting teeth on edge. We would teach a spine to believe what a morning had suggested. That is all healing is, repeated agreements between breath and step. The garden, polite as ever, kept its counsel and its welcome. The robin tucked his head, as if to say he would allow us the credit for what he had arranged. The stars came on over the moor without commentary, and I, who have made a profession of grumbling, went to my bed with a tune. I claimed the thrush had left lying about, and hummed it until sleep answered. Work, once it has put its hand on a house, will not be sent away by a frown. The morning after Colin's first venture into air, the light came in as if it had a list and meant to tick each box. Mary arrived with mud in the right places and resolve in all the others. Dickon's whistle braided itself through the yard. I set a broom against the wall where it would be found exactly when needed, which is a gardener's way of laying blessing on a day. The chair wheels had learned yesterday's grammar. Today we meant to add new words. We brought the boy through the side door like a parcel too precious for the front. He held himself straighter without knowing it. The garden received him with the courtesy it reserves for those who do not ask it to be grand, only honest. The apple tree dappled him with light, as a mother sprinkles water to wake a sleepy child. The robin inspected from the arch and delivered his lecture on punctuality, then demanded bread, which Mary produced as if the bird were on salary. A tale needs its plain detail, so take this from the root of things. Colin set his hands upon the arms of the chair, and Mary said, "We will try the way a nurse says the word sip." Dickon spread a rug upon the path, as if the earth itself might be shy of the boy's feet. I stood by with my grumble polished, the sort that can be turned to praise or to goad at a second's notice. He took a breath that started wrong, shallow and apologetic. Mary corrected him as if she had been born to it. "Deep," she said, "to the bottom, where the clean air hides, and let it out as if you mean to keep living." He did it again, and then once more, and the third time the air went all the way and did not hurt him for it. I saw the colour move along his face like a bird deciding the hedge is safe after all. He lifted himself only a little, only inches that would seem laughable to those who count victories by miles, and then set himself down, not in defeat, but in prudence. We did not clap, we did not preach. We talked of time and the right tightness of ties, and whether a toad in the far bed was the same old fellow who had wintered under the bricks last year. A boy's pride is better fed by natural subjects than by pity. Mary had made for him a discipline, though she would not call it that. Rope for the arms and chest, lifted slow. Breath counted in eights. Eyes on the tallest cane as if it were the measure toward which bone and will might conspire. Dickon, with that cheerful gravity animals trust, taught him how to lean without crumpling, how to sit as if the spine were a young stake asked to hold its share and no more. I corrected the angle of his shoulders with 2 fingers. Not gentle, not cruel. Exactly as I would correct a rose that had mistaken stubbornness for strength. He is a quick mind, that boy, and quick minds make quick vows. He swore in the piping grandeur of a lad who has discovered he can order a day to be different, that he would not be a coward again, that he would be a scientist of himself and the garden both, that he would make his body heed instruction as he meant his heart to do. If the old story calls him Raja, it is because that is how he had imagined himself in a kingdom of pillows and rules. I called him that with a sharpness meant to sting pride into usefulness. Come then, Raja, stand like a king who pays for his throne with his legs. He laughed and coloured, and the word lost its poison. Dr. Craven arrived in the forenoon with his ledger of cautions bound tight in his face. He found the bed empty and the room tidy, and a nurse less flustered than he prefers. When word of our absence reached him by the route's worry travels, he came down the corridor like weather that misunderstands its season. Martha waylaid him with a moral crisis regarding sheets and the virtue of a breeze, and while he fought linen with Latin, we worked 10 good minutes uncontested. When at last he found us, we were discussing the ethics of worms, which I maintain ought to be left in peace whenever possible, and thanked when not. He looked at the chair, at the boy upright against the rug, at the girl counting breaths as if they were pennies saved, and he pronounced the word careful, the way a man pronounces a verdict. The boy disagreed without impertinence. He told his doctor that fear is not a medicine, that a person improves by doing a little more than he did yesterday and sleeping for it afterward. He asked what harm there could be in teaching the spine to remember what trees remember. The doctor, who is not a villain, but is sorely haunted by his own reckonings, could not give a good answer. He retreated with a promise to inspect later, which is a polite word for forbidding what you cannot prevent. We returned to our arithmetic. 10 breaths, 15, 20, with a rest. He pulled at the rope until his arms trembled, and then laughed at the tremble as if it were a joke played by the muscles upon a friend. A thrush tried a scale, and got it wrong, and tried again, and got it right. And I took this as instruction on perseverance more useful than anything I could have said. When at last he stood an inch, then 2, then 3, Mary did not look at me. She looked at the cane we had tied yesterday, as if to remind us all that standing is ordinary work for the living, and not a miracle requiring trumpets. Your scrap from the old book belongs here. The boy spoke of magic. He meant not tricks, not nonsense, but that widening in the chest when hope and effort agree. He declared that if there is a law that makes seeds split the dark and reach for light, it might tolerate our small obedience and do the same for blood and bone. I am not man enough to argue against a law that sets crocus on fire in March. Let the lad call it what he likes. I call it sap, and I have seen it run in everything that consents to live. We eased the morning with common things, because common things are the kindest. Martha sent oat cakes that made sensible crumbs, and the robin took his tithe. I brewed tea on a spirit lamp that has no right to produce a decent cup, and did so anyway. If you have never poured hot water over leaves outdoors, and watched 3 faces soften as steam draws kindness out of weather, you have missed a physic as reliable as any in a doctor's bag. We spoke of nothing in particular, and everything that matters. The chair wheels, scrubbed by Mary until they shone like good intentions, had little to say. They preferred deeds. In the afternoon I set about a task that looked like old man's fussing and was nothing of the sort. I trued the path where it dips, tapping and raking until the gravel held. I added a thin rail of wood to one side of the rug we used for standing so that the boys' feet might trust their border and not argue with it. Mary carried water in a can that insisted on slopping and learned to walk against its mischief. Dickon coaxed a squirrel from the stone and made Colin laugh at a face he did not know he could make. Laughter is a brace that fits any size, but we still wonder whether a person can argue down the old dread by the steady noise of work, or whether dread must be invited into daylight and taught the garden's rules until it forgets its power. If you have ever whistled while crossing a yard at dusk, because whistling is braver than silence, you will understand why a tune can be a tool as good as a trowel. To loosen the mood, take these homely observations gathered like seeds from the day. The second slice of bread is always better because the first has taught your mouth how to be grateful. A coat warmed on a stone in weak sun is worth 3 blankets and no kindness. A path swept at noon looks like pride. The same path swept at day's end looks like care. Choose the latter whenever you can. Toward evening, the boy tried a longer stand. His hands shook. He said, in a voice that belonged to him more than to his fears, that no one was to fuss if he failed. He did not fail. He stood the length of the thrush's song, and then sat with that quick breath that is not panic, but triumph disguising itself out of modesty. He looked at his feet as if they had spoken up for themselves in public and said, "Thank you." Mary made no ceremony of it. She wiped a bit of leaf mould from his cuff and asked whether he preferred to count tomorrow's breaths by 10s or 12s. He chose 12s, greedy as any gardener when the season begins to go his way. Night came down with clean hands. The moor's great chest rose and fell, as if it approved of our arithmetic. In the house the thin cry did not come. In its place came, very faint, the sound of a boy repeating a number as if it were a charm. And if charms are made of breath and will, then I am content to be a believer. I locked the shed and let my palm rest on the grain of the door. Wood tells you when the day has been right. This one had. Tomorrow he would stand again, and farther. Tomorrow the doctor would purse his mouth and swallow his certainty. Tomorrow the path would remember our feet and ease them. The garden had taken the boy's vow and given back its own, that living things, when invited, will live. I walked home with my shadow, the proper length for an honest man, and counted my steps for the pleasure of knowing what a number can do when it is kept. There are days when the sun lays out a cloth upon the grass as plainly as any housemaid, and invites whoever has breath and appetite to sit. The morning that felt like a holiday without permission came with warmth, not for show, but for use. The moor smelled of broom and distant sheep. In the kitchen yard, Martha's talk had more lilt than lecture, which means her mother must have had a spare loaf and a bit of cheese to send along. I carried my tool bag for form. A man likes to look employed even when the weather means to turn him into a guest. Mary arrived with sleeves already pushed, hair refusing the strictness of pins, and the contented untidiness that belongs to children who have found decent work. Dickon came later, walking as if the path had grown out of his boots, a lamb following him with the rudeness only the loved can risk, and that crow hopping along with a pirate's conscience. The robin, of course, took up his post on the arch to pronounce the place properly open for business. We brought Colin through the side door without fuss, as we had learned to do, the chair wheels finding their grammar at once. He held himself upright, with less argument from the string at his shoulders. Sun struck his hair and put a light there that had nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with physics and grace. The apple tree offered shade like a kind hand. The borders gave back colour enough to make you forgive March all its reluctance. Crocus cups of gold and purple, snowdrops finishing their quiet sermon, and under the hedge the first shy tongues of primrose, not yet brave, but thinking on it. Mother Sowerby had sent what she calls a bite to be going on with, and what any honest king would write a decree to obtain. Brown scones with backs crisp from a hot stone, a cold pasty cut straight as a rule, a small jar of something sharp enough to remind a body he is alive, and a wedge of cheese with its own good temper. She had tucked in, for impertinence, 2 apples that still carried the memory of last autumn's air. We set it out on a rug that has seen more ceremony these past weeks than the drawing-room carpets have seen in years. I made grumbling show about crumbs near beds, then sat and ate more neatly than I ever have indoors. A man improves among children who watch him as if he were part of the day's example. We did not call it a picnic. We called it dinner because the clock agreed. Mary passed slices with a gravity that would have honoured communion. Dickon poured milk from a bottle wrapped in damp cloth, as if he were watering a delicate cutting. Colin took bread in his left hand, without noticing he had let the right rest easy on his knee, not clenched for trouble. The robin demanded tithe. He received it with the manner of a taxman and the forgiveness of a friend, and he left his receipt in respectable crumbs. Here's your scrap from the old tale, still warm. Mother Sowerby herself came along the sheltered walk later, plain shawl, boots that talk honestly to mud, eyes that set a room to rights without touching a chair. She greeted me with the affectionate insult Yorkshire keeps. For those it means to honour, and looked at the boy as a woman looks at bread that has risen after a long sulk. "Bless thee," she said, which carries more place and power in her mouth than 10 learned valuations. She did not coo, she did not pity. She told him his legs were like young beanstalks that have found their string, and that his grandest duty was to keep growing. For a minute he looked like a prince receiving the one sort of bow that improves a crown. We made a party of it without noise. Colin stood twice by the rug, while Mother Sowerby talked ordinary talk, the kind that oils joints better than concern. She asked whether the time had taken, and whether we meant to put sweet peas against the far trellis, and whether I had the sense to keep the lads from overwatering. I gave back as good as I got, and felt my grumble fetch up warm from the belly, not cold from the throat. To see that woman is to feel the rightness of tea poured into a thick cup in a kitchen that knows your name. After we ate, there was work, because eating that does not lead to working is only idleness with a napkin. Mary set to the border with the little fork, loosening where winter had made a habit of tightness. Dickon showed her the trick of teasing roots apart as you would tease a tangle out of a child's hair, patient, cheerful, with the story going so the hurt forgets itself. Colin counted breaths in 12s and then in 6s to keep the mind from making mischief, and I corrected his shoulders with the same 2 fingers that have taught roses more manners than sermons ever will. The crow shouted advice that meant more bread, and the lamb lay down with an entitlement that would have been insufferable in a human. The garden spoke in its spring tongue. You could hear the fat shift inside the buds if you have the sort of ear life gives the stubborn. Worms practised their holy industry at the edge of the path. A thrush ran scales and then surprised itself with a tune so exactly fitted to the afternoon that I was tempted to claim authorship. I refrained. The good of a day like that is not improved by boasting. Martha came stealing along with a look that said household and happiness were, for once, not enemies. She carried a napkin-wrapped extra, and a message that sounded like scolding and landed like permission. Mrs. Medlock, it seemed, had decided the boys' tempers were better managed by fresh air than by tyranny. Dr. Craven, measuring his caution, had permitted reasonable exercise under competent supervision, which is a physician's way of saying, "Do not prove me wrong." We nodded as solemn as judges, and went on being careful in the manner that produces results, not terror. Colin asked if the magicky's word, but one I am learning not to quarrel with, would mind a boy laughing while he works. I told him sap does its best when not nagged, and laughter is the nearest thing we have to sunlight on a day that refuses to shine. He tested the theory at once with something like a joke about my hat, and the possibility it had been trimmed from the same bush as the time. It was paltry humour, and I conceded a victory too large for the merit of the jest, but I will forgive much to hear a boy's laugh, where once I heard only a house's complaint. Mother Sowerby walked the beds with the respect a churchwoman gives an altar. She admired what deserved it and ignored what would mend without being stared at, which is a skill I wish more parishioners possessed. Before she went, she laid a hand, quick as a blessing, on the back of the chair and then on the boy's shoulder. Not heavy, not light. Exactly right. "Keep at it," she said, as if the words were a stake and twine both. And then she was off, leaving behind a space warmer than her shawl. Mary's temper, once as prickly as gorse, had softened into that brisk kindness a head gardener keeps for apprentices. She scolded Colin when he cheated account, and praised him like rain when he steadied a breath. She allowed herself foolish luxuries, like humming as she tied in a shoot, or setting a clod to rights with the side of her hand for the clean pleasure of the line. She found a nest of beetles under a brick, and did not squeal, but set the brick back, as if returning someone's hat. There are conversions that make angels sing in theologies I cannot manage. Mine happen with bricks, and I am content. To ease a heavy hour, enclose these trifles in your pocket for when you need them. A slice of cheese tastes twice as good cut. With the pocket knife you sharpened yourself. A mug warmed with a slosh of hot water before you pour anything into it will persuade even poor tea to behave. A path edged straight makes a person walk straighter without knowing why. If you have a door, open it and sit with your knees in the sun for 5 minutes. You will get up a better friend. But we still wonder whether the joy that grows in secret must one day be spent in public, or whether it may, like certain herbs, keep more virtue for being bruised only by trusted hands. If you have ever kept a happiness on the table of your own kitchen for 3 days before telling even your best neighbour, you know how some things sweeten by being held close before they are shared. In the late light, after the food had gone to honest use and the tools had found their hooks again, Colin stood once more, without rope, hands only for balance, and counted to the length of the thrush's refrain, without wobble. He sat with a grin he could not school into dignity. Mary threw him a look, both commander and comrade. Dickon scratched the lamb in the place that undoes pride. I said nothing any court would call praise, and loosened the set of my mouth into something that could pass for agreeable. The robin gave us an unnecessary encore, then allowed evening to take his stage. We closed the door behind us as the lamps in the house made their golden squares. The hinge, properly thanked with invisible oil, kept its counsel. The ivy fell back with dutiful discretion. In his room the boy ate like a reasonable person and slept like one who expects another day. The thin cry had not visited us for some nights, and I felt its absence the way a man feels the gone ache of a tooth he had long ago made resigned space for. I washed my hands at the pump and let cold water tell me truths. I respect more than letters. Today fed tomorrow. Tomorrow would ask for more of the same. I took my hat off as I passed the shed door. No priest had told me to. Work had. That is liturgy enough for me. I set my palm to the wood, and the grain answered easy under skin nicked by decent tools. We had eaten in the sun and spoken like friends, and worked like those who expect good endings only from good middles. The more breathed out, I breathed in. and the garden, with the composure of a thing that knows its mind, held our vows for the night. Houses keep two kinds of shadow. One is honest, cast by lintel and eave, telling you where to stand if you want a cool brow. The other is made of notions, fears, bred and tended until they grow tall enough to pass for architecture. Misselthwaite had both, but the longer one belonged to a man who was not there, and to a man who always was. The master, Mr. Archibald Craven, wandered the world with his sorrow folded neat in his luggage. His brother, Dr. Craven, kept the keys at home, not to the doors you can point at, but to the opinions the household was permitted to keep. If you want your bit of the old tale, take this. 10 years ago, a bough in a garden broke under the laughing weight of a young mother. She fell. The roses were in a glory that day and never forgave themselves. The master closed the door, let ivy memorize the seam, and went away with his grief, like a pilgrim walking without map or saint. He returned now and then, a man in black with his gaze tied to the floor, and the corridors learned to become longer in his presence. I have seen storms on the moor that asked less obedience. Dr. Craven is a different weather. His coat is the respectable sort, his boots quiet, his mouth tight in a way that says he reads ledgers no one else has seen. He loves his brother, I grant him that, but he has also learned to love his own misgivings, and to keep them polished. People like to say he is the boy's guardian. He is. In the same way frost guards a field. It keeps out pests and profits at the same time. He came upon us one forenoon in the secret place, not because he had followed, but because worry in a large house grows ears and feet, and finds things not meant for it. We had Colin standing then, shoulders not yet easy, breath counted in 12s, Mary attending with a nurse's economy, Dickon keeping the hour with a whistle thrushes trusted. The doctor stood at the threshold with a face that had never truly belonged to the outdoors, and asked in a voice cut thin as paper what precisely we thought we were doing. Work, I said, which is the simplest defence for any honest trespass. He took in the arch, newly free of shame, the stake tied with twine that does not cut, the boy with a hand upon the rug's border as if feeling for a promise underfoot. His mouth drew smaller. His eyes measured futures like parcels on a scale. He spoke of spines and hearts and inheritance. He said, a child who has known so much fear must be sheltered from too sudden a change. He said, outcomes in families like ours are written before they are read. He said, weather is not medicine. He said, gardens give chills. He said, the master would not bear disappointment a second time. He said the word careful as a door that keeps its back to you. While he spoke, the boy lost an inch of height he had stolen from dread that morning through effort and laughter. Mary saw it and stood straighter herself, which is her way of telling an adult that a child will not be surrendered without a civil war. I am not a man to cross a doctor in his Latin, but plants have taught me the limited reach of grave pronouncements. There is a law, I told him, older than your book and mine. Sap rises. He did not care for my theology. He turned to the boy and, in a voice that had practised pity more than hope, asked whether he was fatigued. The Raja in him, yes, we tease him with the title until it obeys him, looked up and answered with the grace of a prince learning statesmanship. "I am tired the good way," he said, "the way that sleeps. It is hard for gloom to argue with grammar so plain." Mary, who has converted stubbornness into a sacrament, drew the doctor's eye with a report straight as a line dug between bed and path. She spoke of breath counts, of rope and rug, of the number of minutes between rests, of milk taken, of the absence of night crying. She did not say magic, she did not plead. She made of improvement and inventory a cautious man could carry without spilling. He heard the list and failed, just then, to find a shelf for it in his mind. He is not a villain, I grant him that again. He is a man with a house full of ghosts on his shoulders and a ledger that has, for years, told him sorrow earns more interest than joy. He has also, though he would prune this from his own conscience if he could, the knowledge that a boy who does not mend leaves room in Misselthwaite for a certain professional to go on deciding all things. It is not greed, it is the comfort of being required. We pretend not to like that comfort. We do. He said, at last, that our enterprise might continue within reason and under his eye. And if we made a wreck of the child, we would answer to him and to the master and to God in that order. I told him he had both my attention and my patience, and that he might find the order not always the order he prefers. He blinked. Mary coughed into her sleeve to keep from smiling. Dickon gave the lamb a look that sent it ambling between grief and logic, the way only a lamb can manage. When he had gone, the garden let out a sound that was not a wind and not a bird, and not our imaginations. It was the sound a room makes when a window has been opened 1 inch more than custom, a soft consent. We took back the inch the boy had lost, not with bravado, but with a plain task 3 breaths longer at the count, and a hand moved 1 finger width farther down the rug. He did it, and then demanded with a flicker that looked like mischief's younger cousin, again. You may order a day, a pain, a household tune, but you cannot order that word out of a boy's mouth once he has grown fond of it. Martha brought news folded in a kitchen towel. Mrs. Medlock, in a practical conversion that would make a bishop jealous, had decided that a fine, brisk child in a chair is simpler to manage than a sick one in a bed. The upstairs maid, who had once swallowed the house's weeping like cold soup, now hummed a tune without remembering to be ashamed of it. Servants know before masters what a house intends. If the corridors are to be believed, Misselthwaite intended a change of season. I took a turn by the old wall the master had condemned to Ivy's keeping, and considered the way sorrow chooses its memorials. Some people carve names into stone, some close doors, and make the closed door their daily prayer. I have no sermon for a widower who blocked a gate to keep the wind from speaking his wife's name through a hinge. I will say only this: grief not worked is like a garden not weeded. It grows what you do not mean, and then roots it so deep you must take a spade to your own heart to set it right. Because the day was heavy, let me loosen it with common things. Put on a pot and warm the cup before the tea sees it. You will think better of the world, and the world will think better of you. Fold 2 clean towels and put them where hands can find them without asking. You will have made order a kindness instead of a boast. Cut a slice of yesterday's bread and toast. it under a grill or at a grate, and tell me it is not better than any complicated pudding. The ordinary rescues more moods than oratory. We set ourselves to afternoon work, because the best answer to a long shadow is to stand where it cannot reach. Dickon showed Colin the trick of planting sweet peas by fingers and inch, the twine nipped between teeth, the hole made not by stabbing but by persuasion. Mary edged the path true, her tongue just showing at the corner of her mouth, as it does when she means to get a line perfect without scolding it. I checked ties, not too tight, not too soft, and where dead wood pretended a future, my knife said no with the decency that saves the living from wasting their strength. Dr. Craven returned toward evening, as men do when they intend to catch you out. He found the boy eating a good dinner and refusing to apologize for appetite. He found the girl writing down counts with blunt pencil in a hand that had learned sense before elegance. He found me with dirt under my nails that will never wash entirely clean, and a face I did not bother to straighten into anything but what I am. He pronounced us all stubborn, which is exactly true, and not the insult he meant. Then he surprised us. He said the master had sent word from across water. He was coming home. The house felt that word before the air carried it. Floors that have heard footsteps remembered a particular pair. The long stair tested its own creak, as if tuning for a familiar weight. I went alone to the east wall after the lamps were lit, and put my palm on the brick. "You'll be asked to tell the truth," I said to the door that is not a door until hands declare it, and so shall we. The ivy made no reply a man could print, but it settled in a way a gardener reads as readiness. But we still wonder whether a father's return is a sunrise that shows what we have grown, or a storm that flattens tender rose, and whether joy must be brave enough to stand in full light to finish its cure. If you have ever kept a secret cake for a feast, and then set it out knowing forks and opinions will both have their way with it, you know the cost and the rightness of bringing hidden sweetness to a table. I walked back by the sheds with my grumble in its usual pocket, and something softer warming the other. The robin scolded me for idleness, and then allowed me, by courtesy, to share the last inch of his evening with the holly. "We will manage," I told him, which is a prayer made of Yorkshire and practice. He flicked his tail, as if to say he had been managing all along, and that my discovery of the fact was welcome but not required. Tomorrow would bring the thought of a man in black turning a corner he had avoided for 10 years, and finding a door that had not died of waiting. Tomorrow would ask the boy to choose between pride and welcome, and ask the doctor to choose between fear's profit and hope's loss of authority. Tomorrow would test whether a garden can tell the truth to a grief that has stopped its own ears. I cleaned my knife on the sole of my boot, because steel that mends deserves to travel home, shining. And I slept, not as one finished, but as one put by for the night, like a good tool. Some mornings do not ask permission. They come in with their sleeves rolled and set chairs straight without waiting for your pride to stand up first. The day the boy walked began like that. The moor drew a bright line at the horizon as if sharpening a blade. Birds tuned themselves without argument. I took up my tools and my opinions and found both in better temper than usual. Mary came with that measured haste that means a plan has conspired with sleep. Dickon smelled of lane and lamb. Colin arrived at the side door in his chair with an impatience that had forgotten to be afraid of itself. We did the ordinary things first, because miracles sulk when made a spectacle. Path brushed, rug laid, rope looped and coiled. Breath counted the slow way a kettle approaches boil. The apple threw coins of light on the ground, and called it currency enough for courage. The robin rehearsed us, scolding, approving, taking his tax of crumbs. Then the boy gripped the chair arms, looked not at us but at the far stake where yesterday's cane had learned to keep its line, and told his legs, without words, that the hour had come to earn their keep. He rose inch by inch, the way sap climbs a cane you have properly cut back. No trumpets. A flush along the cheekbone, the chin learning a truer angle, fingers easing from a fist into a plan. He stood as the thrush finished its phrase and began another. And then, because standing had unexpectedly paid its rent, he put one foot forward the length of a child's half-stubborn promise, and then brought its brother to the same address. The body recognized the old arithmetic. He walked, not far, not fine, but away from yesterday and toward himself. We did not cry out. Mary's mouth only softened at the corners, the way a tight bud does when it knows its hour. Dickon's eyes shone with that clean pride that fixes nothing to itself. I cleared my throat at a beetle who had chosen an inconvenient time to conduct business on the path. When the boy reached the stake, he put his hand to it, not to plead, but to thank, and turned with the deliberate dignity of a lad who has remembered he was born a prince and finally approves the job description. You ask for a scrap from the old story. Take this one as he told it, not in the grandness of proclamation, but in the fierce common sense of a new convert. He said that whatever law teaches seeds to split rock, dark, and find light, was in him too, and that he meant to obey it. In the book they call it magic. I have argued against the word and lost. Call it sap. Call it the decency of breath taught to behave. Whatever its name, it took the boy by the shoulders and set them to rights. He practiced as if his life were a tune he had decided to learn by ear. 5 paces, sit, laugh, begin again. 10 paces, sit, scowl at the tiredness until the scowl turned into will, begin again. He discovered what every honest plant knows, that forward is not a straight line, but a pattern of reach and rest, made beautiful by patience. I corrected his left foot's foolish habit with 2 fingers, and the sort of comment that sounds like grumbling to those who have never been loved by criticism. He took it in good part and answered with another step. News travels faster than we pretend. Martha appeared with a napkin that had found its way around scones and scents. She hid the water in her eyes by scolding the lamb for presuming upon the gentility of rugs and boys. The upstairs maid, passing on her way to forget a chore on purpose, paused at the long window and watched until she could claim she had only stopped for air. Even Mrs. Medlock, who keeps her heart like a ledger, contrived to be called to the corridor near the side door and stood very straight, which is the way some women kneel when they will not be caught at prayer. By noon the chair had turned from throne to ally. Colin walked the path once, then twice, then a third time, for the vanity he confessed without shame. He commanded a court as the tale says he once did in Pillows and Quarrels, but this time his titles were Chores and Cheers. He decreed that the garden should have a feast day for no saint but spring. We complied Mother Sowerby's pasty, cheese, milk, slices of apple, breathing out last autumn's sun. He pronounced the food good medicine, and found that saying so cured as surely as swallowing. Dr. Craven arrived with a storm folded under his coat, and finding the thunder had already spent itself elsewhere, was obliged to unpack only weather. He saw the boy upright, his face carrying the authority of effort and not of complaint, and he met me with that small nod men give one another, when both have chosen mercy over pride for an hour. He advised moderation with fewer Latin walls around it than usual. He stood a while under the apple and watched the steps. I saw not triumph, but a counting done backward, the number of forebodings subtracting themselves one by one until the sum required him to be glad or to be false. He chose glad, and looked older for it and better. We worked and we played, which in a good garden are often the same verb. Dickon showed the trick of setting tall pea sticks with the slope that keeps storms from boasting. Mary laid a line so straight the eye felt understood. Colin, leaning one hand on my arm and one on Hope, learned the friendly cruelty of the knife. Dead wood gone to make room for living. He flinched only once, not at the cut, but at the thought of waste. I told him the waste was keeping what cannot thrive. He repeated it as if copying from a copybook, and I heard the lesson take root in places no one can prune for him but himself. The house changed key. Doors that had learned to sigh remembered other notes. The thin night cry had gone off somewhere to practice being something else. The staff spoke in voices that did not feel the need to step lightly around superstition. A place this size trained to sorrow will, at first, fear joy like an untrained horse fears a gate left open. We left it open and let the animal learn its freedom without driving it mad with a whip of exhortation. But we still wonder whether strength grown in secret can stand the noon without withering, and whether a father's eyes, long starved of light, will see what we have trained ourselves to see, or only the shadow of the fear he has fed. If you have ever kept back a song until you could carry it without shaking, then sung it in a room where someone once told you to hush, you know the sweetness and the risk of stepping out. Let me set a few light things on the table to ease us after such labour. Warm the plates if you can. A hot plate forgives an ordinary stew. Keep a clean handkerchief in your pocket. You will need it as often for oiling a hinge as for kindness. Sweep the threshold at day's end. It does nothing for the garden and everything for the soul that tends it. And if your knife is sharp, your tongue should be less so. You will save more living that way than by any sermon. Toward late afternoon, the boy made a little pageant of his new office. He stood without rope, counted in 12s, and walked the length from arch to apple and back. He lifted his head in the precise, proud way of princes who have learned humility the honest way, by failure that did not finish them. Mary clapped once, in air, so that the approval would be felt rather than heard. Dickon whistled the thrush's better tune and made the lamb bow, which the lamb did without art. I pretended to find fault with a tie on the far trellis, and then forgot to correct it for the pleasure of watching the child remember his legs. When we had done as much good as a day can hold without spilling, we set our minds to the next weather. Martha brought a letter with her apron. The master was nearer than rumour, moving homeward in a slow, troubled circle like a man who has been away from his own name too long. If ships possessed the courtesy of gardens, they would have told him sooner. As it is, I have learned to accept human time as imperfect, and to take my satisfaction in keeping the hinge ready. That evening the garden kept a quiet urn, not the quiet that falls on the unloved. The door closed, the ivy drew its curtain with dignified deceit, and we walked out into a house that, for the first time in a decade, did not behave like a convalescent ashamed to improve. Colin ate, laughed, slept. Mary polished the small fork as if it were a medal. Dickon went away with a fox-track choosing him again. I washed my knife, laid it down dry, and put my hand on the shed door in that habit I shall keep until I am myself pruned. Tomorrow the boy means to run, which is another way of saying tomorrow we intend to tell the truth at a faster clip. Tomorrow Dr. Craven will either bless the pace or be left behind by it. Tomorrow I will sweep the path one pass more and test the hinge no one hears. And soon enough to make even an old gardener stand an inch taller, the master will walk the same gravel, find the seam the ivy could not finally hide from love, and learn what patience and children and a robin have done without consulting his sorrow. A house that has been waiting learns to walk before its master returns. The morning news came down the stairs on the breath of a maid who could not keep her voice at a proper hush. He was on the grounds, the master, having come by a long, foolish route that grief maps for men who have never learned to ask directions of joy. He had sent his carriage ahead and chosen the path along the outer wood, as if he wished to consult every leaf before he let the house see his face. Misselthwaite drew itself up with the politeness of a hostess whose favourite guest has been long away. I went first to the east wall and put my palm to brick, a habit you will have noticed. The ivy did not stir, but the door that is and is not a door felt. Under the hand, like a pulse. I could not say whether it belonged to wood or to hope. The robin, pompous and indispensable, lit on the arch and performed an inspection loud enough for a small army. Mary came with a composure that would make an admiral approve. Dickon with wind in his hair and the air of a lad who trusts weather as far as it can be trusted and no farther. Colin came as a boy comes who has discovered that legs are instruments and not just arguments. He would not be carried. He would stand where his father could see him without inventing miracles to cover for fear. We put our house in order. Path brushed until the eye could rest. Rug laid straight. Twine ends trimmed so no untidy thought would catch as it passed. The apple tree spread a light shade generous as bread. I checked the hinge with the smallest syllable of oil. The rag folded so meanly you could not accuse me of shine. We were, all four of us, the decent conspirators of a joy that had earned public life. Mr. Craven appeared at the turn as if the moor had loosened its hold on him by degrees, and then, at last, let him go. He looked a taller man than sorrow remembers. Grief shrinks a shoulder as surely as drought starves a cane. He stopped, hearing the sound the garden keeps only for those who have the right to enter. The small, practice cough of leaves, the mild gossip of water in a can set down. The robin answering a greeting as if he himself owned the place and lent it to us for the afternoon. His hand went to his chest, in the old reflex, and then, finding no familiar ache there to steady him, fell to his side. He saw the seam and the ivy and the idea of a door. He saw me, the old curmudgeon, standing straighter than my back often permits. He saw Mary, chin set in that way of hers, which means she is about to do something kind without asking leave. He saw Dickon, who belongs to the moor as thrushes belong to twilight. And then the whole world narrowed and widened in the same breath, for he saw the boy. Take your scrap from the book plain, because the truth is already handsome. The child, who had been a rumour of weeping and wheels, stood. He stood not like a miracle done to him, but like a promise kept with him. He did not rush, he did not pose. He walked forward 4 steps, then 6, then the careful turning of a lad who knows pride can trip the ankles, and he came to his father with the ordinary magnificence of a boy crossing a bit of garden to greet a man. Mr. Craven put out both hands, a gesture as old as father's and older than this house, and the two of them caught what had been falling between them for 10 years. I turned away. A man may be gruff to a fault, and still know when a scene is not for his staring. The apple leaves made a dimmed, stained window of shade. The moor hummed at the edge of things like a choir that will sing only if asked. Mary bit her lip and did not weep, which is a discipline she has learned with better fruit than many grown women I have known. Dickon spoke a nonsense to the lamb, who accepted it as a royal proclamation and lay down, as if to mark the occasion with politeness. I heard no speech worth reporting. The best words are the small ones, and go by too quickly to be put on paper. Look there, see, yes. If the master said sorry, it was with his hands and his eyes. And the boy answered in the grammar of a chin that rebounded to tremble. They did not require me to translate. My work was done before I could find the right grumble to hide behind. Because we are telling the truth, I will say that Dr. Craven arrived with his caution and found it ill-fitting. He stood outside the seam and measured what he saw with a heart surprised into arithmetic it had forgotten. The house had chosen its arithmetic for him. He put his hand to the brick, as I do, and, like any decent learner, allowed the wall to teach him. The ledger in his face lost a page that day and did not miss it. We made a feast of what Mother Sowerby had called a mouthful, which for that genius means enough to victual a regiment. Brown scones and pasty, a jug of milk wrapped in a wet cloth, apples with last autumn still whispering under their skins. Mr. Craven ate with the awkward gratitude of a man who has been living on memory and finds bread again. Colin, in a triumph that does not require trumpets because it carries its own, fetched a plate to his father and fetched it on his feet. We laughed about the robin's taxes, and whether a crow who says good day has more right to crumbs than his honest, non-talking betters. You may think such talk trifling. It is not. It is the language mercy speaks when it comes home. Work followed, because it must. The master laid a hand upon the old apple and felt under the bark the same quiet that had returned to him. Mary showed him the arch freed from shame. Dickon pointed out the sweet pea row set straight by fingers and string. I demonstrated with more dignity than humility the tie that holds firm without cutting. The boy cut a dead bit from a cane while his father watched and did not flinch. "Waste is keeping what cannot thrive," Colin said. Rote and proud, and I raised an eyebrow sufficient to stand for a benediction. But we still wonder whether joy, brought out at last into daylight, will keep its strength without the sheltering hush that nursed it, and whether sorrow, so long accustomed to its throne, will agree to become a counsellor who speaks when spoken to. If you have ever aired a quilt after winter and watched it remember sunlight as if the cloth had lungs, you know how a thing can be both delicate and durable at once. In the house, changes set about their work like good housemaids. The thin weeping went away and left behind a quiet that was not cowardly. Doors learned to open without apologizing. Martha sang when she forgot herself and scolded when she remembered, which is her proper order. Mrs. Medlock's ledger heart, as I have ungenerously called it, found a new column headed Blessings, and put entries there without pretending they were accidents. The servants' steps no longer slunk around a grief as if it were a sleeping dog that bites when woken. They walked as people do who know what they are about. The master came and went to the garden as a man goes to chapel, when chapel has finally begun to tell the truth back to him. Some afternoons he sat on the bench under the apple and let the leaves throw the old green light across his face. He did not speak loudly. He did not forbid anyone from laughing. He put a gentle hand on the wall where the seam lies, and when he went out, he closed the door carefully, as you would tuck a child at night. He learned what the boy had learned, that the right kind of hush is not a jail, but a promise. As for me, I kept my rounds. I corrected a tie here, trimmed a sulky bit of dead there, and, the truth being unhandsome to hide, took a greater pleasure than I will ever admit in public when the robin consented to address me as if I were one of his staff. I have grumbled reliably all my life, and shall not desert the habit, but I am willing to confess that the taste of tea improves when you have watched a child walk to fetch the kettle who once could not walk to turn his pillow. If you want homely counsel for your own rooms, have these and make of them what use you can. Warm a plate, and even a humble stew will believe in itself. Sweep the step at evening. It honours the feet that went before, and invites better ones tomorrow. Keep a slice by for a late hunger. Generosity sleeps better than thrift that means to fear. And if there is a door in your house that has been pretending to be a wall, take a morning and lay your hand upon it. It may not open. It may only remember you. That is the first kindness. Now, because you have lent an old gardener your ear to the end, let us slow our pace and set our tools in order. The Garden at Dusk is a book that closes itself one page at a time. The crocus cups drain their gold back into their stems. The snowdrops fold their white into prayer. The apple leaves hold the last light as if it were a small flame cupped against a wind. Colin's footsteps run past the arch and back again, the way young feet must when they have been too long denied. The master watches without scolding the hurry. Mary, who once spoke only to command, counts seedlings and thanks them under her breath for their bravery. Dickon makes a whistle that draws a thrush to the nearer limb, and the bird agrees to sing one more phrase, not for pay, but for fellowship. I set the broom where tomorrow's hand will find it. I coil the hose as neatly as a sentence that has learned its grammar. I close the shed and lay my palm upon its door, and here, in the grain, the slow content a day makes when it has been used well. The more breathes a great good breath that carries chill and comfort in one parcel. The robin jumps once, twice, and vanishes into his chosen darkness, with the confidence of a creature who expects to find morning precisely where he left it. We have brought into light what we made in hiding, and it has not withered. A son has stood before a father without props or excuses. A house has traded its long shadow for useful shade. A wall has kept a secret just long enough, and a hinge has remembered its nature. I am a plain man with plain tools, and I have seen enough seasons to trust this truth. The laws that raise sap will not abandon us if we give them honest work and a patient heart. But we still wonder whether tomorrow's weather will love us as today's did, whether sorrow will mind its manners and sit where joy sets it, whether children can carry forward what a robin and a patch of earth taught them without an old man muttering behind their backs. If you have ever walked the length of a garden at evening and felt your own breath come right, you already know the answer is not a sentence, but a way of going along. We will go along. So let the lamps take their places in the house. Let the door draw its curtain of ivy, and keep faith without deceit. Let the apple hold its leaves to the last light. Let the boy sleep with his feet tired and his heart easy. Let the master dream of paths that bend toward home. Let Mary keep her lists and her laughter. Let Dickon promise the morning to every creature that will listen. And let an old fellow set down his broom, tip his hat to whoever watches, and whisper, as one does to seedlings and to souls, grow.